Hello there and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Pull up something comfortable. Maybe a blanket, maybe a pillow, maybe that one old sweater you never planned to keep this long, but somehow trust more than most furniture in your house. Tonight we're going somewhere wide, flat, windy and quieter than it should be. Not to a battlefield, not to a marble hall in Washington, not to a gold rush town or a factory floor or a president's desk with men gathered around it looking serious for a photograph. Tonight we're going to the American plains in the 1930s, to a farm that was supposed to mean security, independence and a future, and we're going to watch something almost impossible happen. We're going to watch the land itself begin to leave. And here is the thing that makes the Dust Bowl so difficult to understand from a distance. Most disasters arrive as events. A fire burns a house. A flood rises through a town. A bank closes its doors. A storm breaks windows and tears away roofs. But the Dust Bowl was stranger than that. It was not one bad day, even though there were days so bad that people remembered them for the rest of their lives. It was not one failed crop, even though crop failure was everywhere. It was a long undoing. It was the slow collapse of trust between people and the ground beneath their feet. It was waking up one morning and finding dust on the windowsill, then dust on the table, then dust in the flour bin, then dust in the baby's throat, then dust piled against the fence like snow, then the bank letter, then the auction notice, then the car packed with mattresses, children, frying pans, a Bible, and whatever dignity could fit between them. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you in a room with clean air and a steady floor and a window you can open without thinking about what might come through it? Is there a lamp on near you? Or are you listening in the dark with only the small glow of a screen nearby? I ask, because for the families we are visiting tonight, the idea of a clean room, a clear window, and air that did not have to be strained through cloth would have sounded almost luxurious by the middle of the 1930s. Not fancy, not rich, just clean, just breathable, just a home that stayed inside while the outside stayed outside. If this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you find yourself settling in and feeling that quiet pull of history, it would mean the world to me if you hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. You do not have to do it right now. Do it when you feel it. When something in this story makes you pause or think or remember that ordinary people once survived things that never made them famous. And if you want to share where you're watching from tonight, your city, your country, your couch, your kitchen table, some quiet corner of the world I may never get to see, leave it in the comments. I genuinely love reading those. There is something fitting about beginning a story of people scattered by wind by noticing where we all are now. Now, let us go back. Not all at once. Slowly. Let the modern room around you fade a little. Let the sound of traffic or heating or rain outside become something else. Let us place ourselves somewhere on the southern Great Plains in the early 1930s, perhaps in the Oklahoma Panhandle, or western Kansas, or the Texas Panhandle, or eastern Colorado, in that broad region where the sky seems too large for the human mind to comfortably measure. The house is not dramatic. It is not the ruined farmhouse you have seen in black and white photographs. Not yet. It is still a working home. There is a barn, a windmill, a few outbuildings, a line of fence posts and fields that once promised more than they could safely give. The family living there has not yet decided that history is happening to them. That is important. They do not wake up in the morning and say, "We are living through the Dust Bowl." People almost never know the name of the disaster while it is still taking them apart. The father may have come to this land as a young man, or his father may have come before him, drawn by one of the oldest promises in American life. Land. Your own land. Not a rented room in a city, not a factory whistle telling you when to move, not a landlord collecting from you at the end of every month, but land that answered to your hands. The government had encouraged settlement across the plains for decades. Railroads advertised it. Land agents praised it. Newspapers printed hopeful reports. Families came from the east, from the south, from Europe, from places where land was scarce or expensive or already claimed by someone else's name. They arrived with wagons, then later with trains and trucks, with seed, tools, children, debt, and the kind of optimism that can look foolish after the fact but feels entirely reasonable when everyone around you shares it. And for a while, it seemed to work. That is the part we need to sit with. The Dust Bowl did not begin with obvious failure. It began with success. In the years before the 1930s, especially during and after World War I, wheat prices rose, and wheat was what the plains could produce in astonishing amounts when rain came at the right time. A farmer who had once ploughed with horses might buy a tractor. A field that had once been too large to break by hand could now be turned over faster than earlier generations would have believed. Native grasses that had held the soil for centuries were cut, ripped, buried, and replaced with rows of wheat. The old grass roots had reached deep into the earth. They had formed a living net, a kind of underground grip that held the plains in place through dry years and hard winds. But wheat did not hold the soil that way. Wheat could feed a family, pay a mortgage, buy machinery, and fill railroad cars. It could not anchor the land when the rain stopped. Here is something that is easy to miss. The people who ploughed that grass were not cartoon villains. They were not stupid. They were not trying to destroy anything. Most of them were trying to survive, improve, pay loans, raise children, and take advantage of a market that rewarded production. If a neighbour bought more land and planted more wheat and paid down his note, what did that seem to prove? If rain came several seasons in a row, what did that seem to confirm? There was a phrase often repeated in the settlement of the plains, the idea that rain follows the plough. It was wrong, but it was a comforting wrongness. It suggested that farming itself could improve the climate, that human effort could call moisture out of the sky. And on the plains, where hope had to be practical or it was useless, people believed many things that helped them keep going. By the time the 1930s arrived, the Great Depression had already begun tearing through the rest of the country. Banks failed, jobs disappeared, businesses closed, men who had worked for wages found themselves standing in breadlines. But out on the plains, the disaster had its own shape. It came through the sky and the soil at the same time. The drought began hardening the land. The rainfall that families counted on did not come in the way it had before. Heat rose off the fields, crops withered, grasshoppers and jackrabbits appeared in numbers that seemed almost unreal. Wind moved across bare fields with nothing strong enough to stop it. The drought of the 1930s covered much of the plains for years, damaging crops through lack of rain, high temperatures, high winds, insect infestations and repeated dust storms. At first, the dust may have seemed like a nuisance, a dirty house, a gritty mouth, a day when laundry had to be washed again. Farmers knew wind, they knew dry spells. The plains had never been gentle country. But then the dust did something different. It thickened, it rose, it travelled. It entered houses through cracks that had already been stuffed with rags. It came under doors, around windows, through keyholes, between boards, down chimneys. A woman could wipe the table clean and turn around to find a new layer settling behind her. Food had to be covered. Beds had to be covered. Babies slept with damp cloths near their faces. People hung wet sheets over windows and doors, not as decoration, not as housekeeping, but as a defence that did not fully work. The land became bare enough that the strong winds of the Great Plains began to blow the soil away, and dust clouds could darken the sky for days while covering homes and farm buildings. Now, I want you to imagine one small thing rather than the whole disaster at once. Imagine pouring flour into a bowl, not a lot, just enough for bread. You tap the sack, and a little white powder rises in the air. It floats for a second and settles on your hand. Now imagine that same fineness, but brown and grey and carrying the smell of dry earth, manure, dead plants, and whatever else the wind has scraped from miles of farms. Imagine it not as a puff, but as weather. Imagine it filling the horizon. Imagine it turning noon into something like evening. Imagine breathing it, because there is no other air available. That was not an image from a novel. That was daily life for thousands of families. There is a reason people called some of these storms black blizzards. The phrase sounds dramatic until you read what happened during them. A wall of dust could appear at the edge of the sky and move toward a farm faster than a person expected. Chickens went to roost in the middle of the day because their bodies believed night had come. Cattle turned away from the wind and stood with their heads lowered. Static electricity built in the air. Cars stopped on roads because drivers could no longer see. People caught outside tied themselves to fence lines or followed ditches by feel. Children were called in from school early if anyone could see the storm coming in time. If not, they waited. They sat inside classrooms while dust pressed against the windows and teachers tried to keep their voices steady. The day that would become the most famous of all came on April 14th, 1935. Black Sunday. The morning in some places began warm and clear enough that people let themselves relax. That detail matters because disasters often hurt in proportion to the hope they interrupt. Families visited neighbours. Some went driving. Children played outside. Then a cold front pushed through the plains and lifted an enormous wall of dust. The storm moved across hundreds of miles, dropping visibility and turning the day black in town after town. The National Weather Service records Black Sunday as one of the defining storms of the Dust Bowl, with blowing dust driven by drought and poor soil conservation practices that left the land exposed. But tonight, I do not want to rush to Black Sunday too quickly, because the question in front of us is not only why one storm was terrible. The question is why thousands of Americans lost everything. Everything is a large word. People use it casually, but it is not casual when it is true. Everything meant the crop in the field and the money that crop would have brought. It meant the seed for next year. It meant the cow sold because feed was gone. It meant the horses too thin to work. It meant the tractor repossessed. It meant the house mortgaged beyond rescue. It meant the farm auction where neighbours stood in a half circle and watched the objects of a family's life sold piece by piece. A bedstead, a plough, a team of mules, a cook stove, a rocking chair, a box of tools. Things that had names inside the household became lots in a sale, and this is where the Dust Bowl becomes more than a weather story. Drought did not act alone. Wind did not act alone. Bad farming practices did not act alone. The market mattered. Debt mattered. The Great Depression mattered. When wheat prices fell, a farmer who had borrowed money during better years could not simply wait out the weather. The bank still expected payment. Taxes still came due. Children still needed shoes. Machines still broke. Animals still ate. A family might do everything humanly possible and still lose ground because the numbers no longer added up. That is one of the hardest truths in this story. Many people lost everything, not because they failed to work, but because work was no longer enough. Let that sit for a moment. We are very fond, especially in America, of the idea that effort and outcome are closely related. Work hard and you will make it. Save carefully and you will be safe. Build something and it will stand. The Dust Bowl was a brutal argument against that simple version of the world. People worked until their bodies were worn down. Women sealed windows and cooked through dust and washed children whose hair filled with grit again before bedtime. Men walked fields they could no longer save. Children learned not to complain because everyone was already afraid. And still the land moved. Still the bank came. Still the sky turned brown. Inside one of these houses, the day begins with dust before breakfast. The mother shakes out a cloth at the door and the wind throws some of it back at her. The father stands outside looking toward the field, not because there is much to see, but because a farmer looks at the field even when the field has become bad news. The children may be quieter than usual. In a farm family, children understand danger earlier than adults sometimes imagine. They hear conversations after supper. They notice when coffee is stretched thinner, when meat disappears from meals, when their mother stops mentioning new fabric for school clothes, when their father stops talking about next season in a confident voice. They may not understand markets, erosion, federal relief or mortgage law, but they understand when the adults have begun speaking softly. The house itself carries the strain. Dust collects in corners, it lies along the windowsill, it settles into bedding. It coats dishes and cupboards that do not close tightly enough. A woman might set the table and then turn the plates upside down until the last second before eating. Imagine that as an ordinary practice, not for a picnic, not during construction. At home, in your own kitchen, plate upside down, cup covered, bread wrapped, water protected, every object in the house treated as if the outside world is trying to claim it. There was illness too, because dust was not merely dirt, it entered lungs. People developed what was commonly called dust pneumonia, especially children, older people, and those already weakened by poor diet or exhaustion. Doctors in small towns saw patients coughing, feverish, short of breath, their bodies fighting against air that could no longer be trusted. Families did not always have money for medical care. Even when they did, what was the prescription for a child who had to keep breathing in a place where the air itself carried the disaster? Move away, perhaps. But moving required money too. It required gasoline, a car that could run, somewhere to go, and the emotional violence of admitting that the life you built could not be saved. This is the part of the story where we must be careful with the word choice. People did not simply leave. Leaving sounds too clean, too voluntary. Many were pushed by failure after failure until staying became another way of losing. Some abandoned farms because there was no chance of making a living. Many went west looking for work, especially toward California, where agricultural labour seemed possible even when it was harsh, crowded, and often humiliating. The Library of Congress describes Dust Bowl farm families fleeing westward after losing the chance to make a living on their land. But before the road west, before the overloaded car, before the migrant camps and the word Okie thrown like an insult, there was the moment at home when a family understood that the farm had turned against them. Or perhaps that is not quite fair. The farm had not turned against them. The farm was exhausted. The soil had been asked to do too much. The sky had given too little. The market had punished them. The bank had waited as long as it was willing to wait. The family had held on as long as people can hold on, and then the holding ended. I want to bring this closer. Imagine standing in your kitchen and deciding what to take from your life, because your life can no longer stay where it is. Not what to pack for a holiday, not what to put in storage, what to take because the rest may be gone forever. A skillet, because you can cook with it anywhere. Blankets, because children get cold in cars and camps. A photograph, because faces matter when places are lost. Tools, if there is room, because tools may become wages. Clothes, patched and folded. A little food, maybe a jar of something canned from a better season. Maybe a Bible. Maybe a toy if a child refuses to let go and the parents do not have the heart to say no. Outside, dust moves along the ground in little streams. Not a storm yet, just enough to remind everyone why this is happening. This was not ancient history. That is another thing worth remembering. The Dust Bowl happened in the age of cameras, radios, automobiles, newspapers, federal agencies, and recorded testimony. People who lived through it could later describe it in ordinary American voices. They were not distant figures in powdered wigs or medieval villages. They wore overalls, dresses, work boots, hats and aprons. They drove Fords and Chevrolets if they had them. They listened to news of Franklin Roosevelt. They knew about banks, prices, elections and relief programs. They belonged to a modern country, or at least a country that believed itself modern, and still thousands of them found themselves fighting for survival against dust. There is something deeply unsettling about that. It means that losing everything does not always require a primitive world. It can happen in a world with newspapers, machines, experts, and promises. It can happen when many reasonable decisions, made by many ordinary people over many years, meet a climate that does not forgive those decisions. It can happen when a national economy collapses at the same time the local environment fails. It can happen slowly enough that people keep adjusting, keep hoping, keep saying maybe next year until next year arrives with more wind. Tonight, as we begin this story, I want you to keep one image in your mind. Not the famous photograph of a migrant mother, though we will come to the people on the road later. Not the towering wall of Black Sunday, though we will stand in its shadow soon enough. For now, picture a farmer holding a handful of soil. He has held soil all his life. He knows its weight when it is healthy, its smell after rain, the way it clumps or crumbles, the difference between land ready for seed and land that needs time. But now it runs through his fingers too easily. It is dry, fine, loose. It does not feel like a future. It feels like something already leaving. That is where the story starts. Not with the worst storm. Not with the final foreclosure notice. Not with the long road to California. It starts with a terrible realization that arrived unevenly across the plains, house by house, field by field, family by family. The rain was not coming back in time. The grass that once held the land was gone. The wheat could not save them. The old confidence, the belief that hard work could make the plains obey, was beginning to crack. And outside the farmhouse, under a sky too wide to comfort anyone, the wind was rising again. The wind was rising again, and at first that did not mean catastrophe. That is one of the first things we have to understand if we are going to be fair to the people who lived through this. Wind on the plains was normal, dry weather was normal, a few bad weeks were normal. A bad season, painful as it was, did not automatically mean the world had changed. Farmers were used to watching the sky and waiting. They were used to saying it will come. They were used to delaying a decision because the next cloud bank might be different from the last one. Hope, on a farm, was not a sentimental thing. It was part of the equipment. So in the beginning, when the rain failed, many families did what farm families had always done. They watched. They measured. They looked toward the west in the evenings. They checked the colour of the clouds and the smell of the air. They listened to neighbours, to county agents, to old-timers, to the radio if they had one, to anyone who seemed to know whether the weather was turning. A farmer might stand outside after supper with one hand on the porch post, not talking much, his face angled toward a sky that gave him nothing. His wife might be inside washing the same dust from plates she had washed the day before, pretending not to notice how long he'd been standing there. Children might still be playing, still young enough to think a dry spell meant more dust on their shoes and fewer chores in muddy weather. No one yet wanted to say what everyone was beginning to feel. And this is where the story becomes harder than a simple warning about bad farming. The families who believed the rain would come back had reasons for believing it. Many of them had seen the plains produce. They had seen wheat stand tall in fields that looked empty only a few years before. They had seen good rain years. They had seen neighbours pay down loans, buy better equipment, add rooms to houses, send children to school in town with new coats in winter. The 1920s had not been easy for every farmer, but in many parts of the southern plains there had been enough rain and enough wheat to make expansion seem not only reasonable, but responsible. Fairly favourable climatic conditions in the 1920s helped settlement and cultivation expand across the Great Plains before the unusually dry years that began around 1930. Let us sit for a moment with one ordinary farmer before the worst years arrive. He is not rich. That matters. He is not the sort of man who can afford mistakes for long. He has land, some of it paid for, some of it still tied to debt. He has machinery that seemed like progress when he bought it. Perhaps a tractor. Perhaps a combine shared or hired at harvest. Perhaps equipment bought on credit because every acre planted might bring in enough to justify the risk. He has seen what wheat can do when the timing is right. Wheat looks simple from a distance. A wide field, a green rise in spring, a gold surface in summer, men and machines moving through it. But to the farmer, Wheat is a calendar, a wager, a promise, and a debt schedule all at once. You plant because you believe there will be moisture enough. You borrow because you believe there will be a crop enough. You expand because the last good year tells you the next good year may be waiting. Now, I know what this can sound like from the comfort of nearly a century later. It can sound obvious. Why plough so much grassland? Why plant so much wheat in dry country? Why believe rain would keep coming? But hindsight is one of the cheapest forms of intelligence. It costs nothing to know the answer after the disaster has done its explaining. The people living then did not have our photographs, our soil studies, our documentaries, our classroom maps shaded in brown. They had memory, advice, advertisements, prices, family needs, and the evidence of their own eyes. If the land had produced last year, if it produced the year before, if the bank was willing to lend, if the government had encouraged settlement, if the railroad had promoted the region, if neighbours were breaking more sod and planting more wheat, then caution could look like fear. And on the plains, fear did not buy seed. There was also an older American belief working underneath all of this, one that had been moving westward for decades before the Dust Bowl. It was the belief that land existed to be improved by use. A field covered in native grass might look healthy to us now because we understand what those roots were doing. But to many settlers and boosters, unploughed grassland looked unfinished, idle, waiting. A farmer's job was to turn land into production. A plough did not look like a threat. It looked like civilization arriving in a straight line behind a team of horses or the metal weight of a tractor. The more acres under cultivation, the more secure the future seemed. More wheat meant more money. More money meant payments made, children clothed, machinery repaired, church dues paid, taxes covered, a little more respect in town. The landscape was being judged by what it could sell, and wheat sold. This belief had a phrase attached to it, and once you hear it, you understand a great deal about how people talk themselves into confidence. Rain follows the plough. The idea had circulated across the plains in the late 19th century and lingered in different forms after that. It suggested that cultivation itself could help bring rainfall, that breaking the soil, planting crops, and settling the land might change the climate in favour of the farmer. As science, it was wrong. As encouragement, it was powerful. It allowed families, land companies, railroad promoters, and entire communities to imagine that effort and weather were connected in a moral way. Work the land, and the land would respond. Build farms, and the sky would become generous. It was not just a theory about rainfall, it was a theory about deserving. And human beings like theories that make hardship feel temporary. If a dry month comes, you tell yourself the rain is late. If a dry season comes, you tell yourself the cycle is turning. If the second bad year arrives, you tell yourself you've seen trouble before. A family cannot live indefinitely in the language of collapse. They have to make breakfast. They have to repair the fence. They have to decide whether to plant. They have to send children to school. They have to answer a letter from the bank, so they use the words available to them. Dry spell, hard year, unusual weather. It will break soon. We just need one good rain. That phrase, one good rain, must have been spoken thousands of times across the plains. It is the kind of phrase that carries more weight than it seems to. One good rain could settle the dust for a while. One good rain could soften the ground. One good rain could help the wheat stand. One good rain could make the pasture look alive again. One good rain could quiet the worry at supper. It would not solve every debt, repair every mistake, or restore every field, but it could create enough hope to keep people where they were, and that mattered, because leaving was not a simple act. Leaving meant admitting that your judgment, your labour, your father's labour perhaps, and every sacrifice made to stay on that land had led to a place you could no longer defend. In the early stages of drought, the farm still looked like a farm. That is important too. Disasters often have a middle period when the shape of ordinary life remains, but the inside of it has changed. The barn is still there. The table is still set. The children still do lessons. The windmill still turns if the wind is right. The family still goes into town on Saturday when there is enough gasoline or enough reason. Neighbours still talk in front of the store. Church still meets. The mail still comes. A person passing through might not immediately understand that a quiet emergency has begun. But inside those routines, numbers are shifting. The yield is lower, the feed is shorter, the price is worse, the note is due, the well is lower, the topsoil is looser underfoot. Let us go into town for a moment, because the Dust Bowl was not only experienced in isolated farmhouses. A plains town lived through the drought in public. The main street might have a bank, a general store, a grain elevator, a post office, a school, a church, a feed store, a mechanic's shop, maybe a small hotel or boarding house. In good years, the grain elevator was a symbol of confidence. It stood above the town like proof that the surrounding land could feed distant markets. Wheat came in by wagon and truck. Men talked prices. Children climbed where they were not supposed to. Dust was ordinary dust then, the harmless dirt of traffic and work. But as the dry years deepened, the elevator became another reminder of what was missing. Less grain meant less money moving through every business connected to the farms. A failed crop was not one family's problem. It spread outward through merchants, bankers, teachers, doctors, churches and county relief offices. The Great Depression made this worse in a way that cannot be separated from the weather. Wheat prices had already fallen after the wartime demand that had encouraged production. Farmers who had expanded during better years now faced lower prices, tighter credit, and fewer ways to recover. A man could grow a crop and still not earn enough if the price was too low. Then the drought could take even that possibility away. This is where the trap closed. In a wet year with decent prices, debt might be managed. In a dry year with terrible prices, debt became a weight around the family's future. If a farmer had mortgaged land or equipment, the paper did not dry up and blow away with the soil. It stayed. It waited. The drought was natural, but foreclosure was human. The wind did not write notices. Banks did. Still, for a time, many people believed the rain would return because memory told them it had returned before. The plains had always had cycles. Older residents remembered dry years. Some remembered earlier droughts that had hurt badly and then passed. That kind of memory can save people from panic, but it can also delay recognition. If you have lived through 3 hard seasons in your life, and the rain eventually came each time, then the 4th hard season may not look like a new era. It looks like something to endure. Farmers are trained by necessity to endure. They do not abandon land every time the sky disappoints them. They hold. They adjust. They sell one thing, patch another, plant less, plant more, try a different field, borrow seed, wait for a cloud. At the kitchen table, the conversation would not sound like history. It would sound like arithmetic. How much seed is left? How much feed for the cow? Can we keep the team another month? What did the banker say? Did the neighbour get relief work? Should we try sorghum? Should we leave that field fallow? How much flour is in the bin? Can the children wear last year's shoes? How much would the chickens bring if we sold some? These questions are not dramatic on their own, but taken together they are the sound of a household tightening itself around a crisis. And over all of it, there was the stubborn promise of the sky. Anyone who has lived by weather knows how much meaning a cloud can carry. In a city, a cloud might change your plans for an umbrella. On a dry farm, a cloud can change the feeling inside your chest. A line of dark clouds on the horizon might bring people outdoors. A smell of moisture in the wind could make someone stop speaking in the middle of a sentence. Thunder in the distance, even when no rain fell, could set a whole house listening. The first drops on a roof after weeks of dryness must have sounded almost unbelievable. Children might run to the door. Adults might tell them to stay back, partly because of lightning, partly because they did not want the children to see hope fail if the shower passed too quickly. Sometimes the rain did come. That may be the cruelest part. The Dust Bowl was not one unbroken absence of rain everywhere all the time. There were showers, there were storms, there were places that got temporary relief. A little green might return, wheat might begin and then fail, grass might start and then burn off in the heat. These partial mercies kept people believing longer. A total disaster announces itself. A wavering disaster bargains with you. It says, not yet. Maybe next month. Maybe this field. Maybe this year will turn. And so families stayed because the evidence was never simple enough at first. A rainstorm could settle the dust and convince everyone that the worst had passed, only for the wind to rise a week later and lift the land again. The land itself had changed in ways that were not immediately visible to everyone. Native prairie grasses had spent centuries adapting to dry conditions, wind, grazing animals and fire. Their roots held soil deep and wide, making the surface far more stable than it looked. When that grass was removed over millions of acres, the plains lost one of its best defences. Wheat roots did not replace that structure. Ploughed fields, especially after failed crops, left soil exposed. When drought dried the top layers into loose powder, the wind had something to take. The Library of Congress describes the land as overfarmed and overgrazed when drought began in 1930, allowing winds to raise clouds of dust across the plains. But a farmer standing in his field did not necessarily think in millions of acres. He thought in his own quarter section, his own fence line, his own place. That is one reason environmental disasters are so difficult to grasp while they are happening. Each person sees a fragment, one field blowing, one neighbour leaving, one bad harvest, one bank closing, one storm worse than usual. Only later do those fragments become a named event. Only later does a map turn individual suffering into a region. There were official voices too, and not all of them spoke with certainty. County agents, agricultural colleges, federal workers and local leaders tried to advise farmers, but knowledge developed unevenly, and emergency moved faster than reform. Soil conservation methods existed, but they were not yet widely practiced or fully supported across the region before the worst damage. Some farmers did use contour ploughing, crop rotation, strip cropping, or leaving stubble to hold the soil, but many had neither the money nor the habit nor the local pressure to change quickly enough. A man deep in debt might understand that resting land would help the soil and still plant because he needed a crop. Conservation can sound wise in a pamphlet and impossible at the kitchen table when the bank expects payment. This is something I want you to really sit with. Bad decisions made under pressure do not feel like bad decisions at the time. They feel like the only decisions left. If wheat prices are low, one answer is to plant more wheat to make up the difference. If debt is heavy, one answer is to produce more. If a tractor can break land faster, one answer is to use it. Each choice makes sense inside the narrow frame of one family trying to survive 1 year. But when thousands of families make the same choice across fragile land during a drought, the result can become disaster on a scale none of them intended. Inside the home, the belief in returning rain was not always spoken as confidence. Sometimes it appeared as routine. The mother saved jars as if there would be vegetables to can. The father repaired equipment as if there would be a harvest to bring in. Children were told to finish schoolwork because life would continue. Seed catalogues still arrived. Church announcements still listed gatherings. Women still planned meals around what might come from gardens if the season improved. Men still went to town to ask about prices as if prices mattered without crops. People kept the frame of normal life standing because no one knew what else to do, and yet doubt entered. It entered in small, practical ways. A farmer might begin checking the sky less often, not because he cared less, but because looking hurt. A woman might stop talking about planting a garden in one particular patch because the soil there had drifted badly. A child might notice that adults no longer laughed when someone joked about needing rain. Neighbours might speak more quietly after church. Men who once swapped predictions might now shrug. That shrug is a historical document too, even if no one wrote it down. It says that the old words were beginning to fail. The animals knew before the records did. Cattle had to eat what the land no longer gave. Horses and mules, still essential on many farms even in the age of tractors, needed feed that was becoming expensive or unavailable. Chickens scratched at dry ground. Gardens struggled. A milk cow could become both precious and burdensome, giving food but requiring care. Families faced choices that cut into the emotional life of the household. Selling livestock was not like clearing out a shed. Animals had habits. Children knew them. A team of horses might represent years of labour. A cow might have carried a family through lean months. But feed costs money, and dust does not grow hay. The rain everyone believed would come back was not just weather. It was the hidden support under every promise people had made. Mortgages assumed rain. Seed loans assumed rain. Machinery purchases assumed rain. Town businesses assumed rain. School attendance assumed rain, because families needed enough stability to keep children in class instead of pulling them into work or moving away. Marriages absorbed the strain of rain that did not come. Parents measured their own worth against rain that did not come. Faith communities prayed for rain, and when rain still did not come, they had to absorb that silence too. There were prayer meetings for rain in some communities, and we should not treat that lightly. People prayed because the need was real. A dry farm family did not pray for rain as a metaphor. They prayed because water meant wheat, feed, milk, gardens, health, money, and time. A congregation gathering to ask God for rain was not performing a quaint rural ritual. They were asking for the conditions that made life possible. When clouds formed after such a prayer, people remembered. When they passed without rain, people remembered that too. Faith could comfort, but it could also make the drought feel personal in ways that were difficult to speak aloud. Meanwhile, the physical signs became harder to ignore. Soil began collecting where it should not collect. It drifted against fence rows, filled ditches, covered roads, and crept up the sides of buildings. A field did not need to vanish in one day to be lost. It could lose a little with each wind until the shape of the land changed. Fence posts that once stood tall might appear shorter as dust piled around them. In some places, drifts reached the level of windows or buried machinery. Dust storms could darken skies for days, and even sealed homes might still end up with thick layers of dust inside. Think about what that does to the mind. A house is supposed to separate inside from outside. That is one of the basic comforts of home. Even a poor house, even a drafty house, even a house with patch walls and a roof that complains in the wind, is supposed to provide some boundary. During the Dust Bowl, that boundary failed daily. Dust entering the home was not only a cleaning problem, it was evidence that the family could not keep the world out. The mother's labour became repetitive in a way that could wear down the spirit. Sweep, wipe, cover, shake, wash, repeat. No permanent victory, only temporary resistance. Still, rain remained the imagined rescue. People spoke of it because there was nothing else with the same power. Federal relief could help. Better farming methods could help. Loans could be extended. Neighbours could share. But rain was the thing that could make the whole system seem sane again. Rain could make the advice work. Rain could make the seed matter. Rain could make the land look forgiving. Without it, every solution felt partial. Then came the cruel education of the 1930s. The drought did not behave like a single bad season. It stretched and returned, and some areas experienced drought conditions for years. The National Drought Mitigation Center describes the Dust Bowl as centered in the western third of Kansas, southeastern Colorado, the Oklahoma Panhandle, the northern Texas Panhandle, and northeastern New Mexico, while the wider hardships came to symbolize the national suffering of the 1930s. Dust storms became common across the Great Plains, especially in the early and middle years of the decade, with drought and deep ploughing leaving soil exposed after natural grasses were gone. By then, Believing in rain required more effort, not because people were foolish, but because disappointment had become evidence. If the first dry year was a test, the second was a warning, and the third was a rearrangement of reality. Farm families began to understand that the old pattern might not return in time to save them. Some still stayed. Some had no way to leave. Some were determined not to be driven off. Some believed leaving would be worse. Some had elderly parents, sick children, debts, no reliable vehicle, or nowhere to go. Staying was not always confidence. Sometimes staying was being trapped in place. The phrase, "lost everything," begins here. Before the auction, before the road, before the migrant camp. It begins with the loss of expectation. A family can survive with little if they believe next season will restore the balance. They can eat plain meals, patch clothes, sell extras, and make do if the future still feels open. But when the rain fails long enough, the future narrows, plans become smaller, then they become emergency plans, then they become decisions no one wanted to make. A father who once imagined passing land to his children now wonders whether he is leaving them debt. A mother who once imagined her children growing up on the farm now wonders whether dust is making them sick. A boy who once expected to work the same fields now watches those fields move across the yard. A girl who once helped gather eggs now hears her parents discuss selling the hens. These are not the dramatic images usually used to tell the Dust Bowl story, but they are where the disaster lived most of the time, not only in the sky turning black, but in the slow shrinking of what a family dared to expect. There is a particular sadness in the fact that many people waited for rain not because they denied reality, but because rain had been real before. They were not waiting for magic, they were waiting for the return of a pattern they had known. That is why the betrayal felt so deep. The land had produced, the sky had opened, wheat had grown, towns had functioned, children had been born into homes that seemed permanent enough. The disaster was not that people believed in something impossible from the beginning. The disaster was that conditions changed after they had built their lives around the belief that the good years were evidence of normal. Outside the farmhouse, another evening arrives. The sky has the hard, pale look that dry weather gives it. The father comes in from the field with dust in the creases of his face. He does not need to say much. The children know, by the way, he removes his hat. The mother has covered the bread, covered the plates, covered the water. A damp cloth lies near the window where dust has been pushing through. Supper is simple, quieter than anyone wants it to be. Someone mentions a cloud seen in the distance that afternoon. Someone else says it may build by morning. No one argues, no one fully believes it. But no one wants to take the sentence away either. After the dishes, after the lamp is turned low, after the children are meant to be asleep, the adults remain awake. This happened in many homes, in many forms. They talk in numbers again. What can be paid? What can be delayed? Who is left? Who is thinking of leaving? Whether to plant, whether not planting is surrender, whether planting is throwing good seed into a field that cannot hold it. The rain is still present in the conversation, even when no one says the word. It is the missing party at the table. It is the answer to every question and the answer that does not arrive. And then, sometime later, perhaps that night, perhaps the next afternoon, perhaps a week after everyone had nearly convinced themselves the air had settled, the wind begins to work on the open fields again. At first it lifts a little soil close to the ground, then more. The horizon changes colour. A line appears where the sky should be clear. Someone sees it from the yard and calls inside. Chickens grow restless. A horse turns its head away. The house is closed as quickly as it can be closed, though everyone knows it will not be enough. Cloth is pushed into cracks. Windows are checked. Children are brought in. The light changes. The room grows dim before evening. The rain everyone believed would come back is not what comes through the sky. What comes instead is the field itself, rising, moving, and finding every opening. What comes instead is the field itself, rising, moving, and finding every opening. At first, it is not a wall. That is important. The soil does not always announce itself like a monster crossing the horizon. Some days it begins low, close to the ground, almost modest. A thin brown veil slides over the furrows. Dust lifts from the bare places where wheat should have been. It runs in little streams across the road, catches against the fence line, gathers in the corners of the yard, and settles in the tracks left by wagon wheels or tyres. If you had never seen the worst of it, you might call it unpleasant and go back inside. You might tell yourself the wind is up today. You might say the air is dirty. You might wait for evening expecting the whole thing to calm down when the sun drops. But the people who lived there began to understand that something had changed. The soil was not merely dusty. It had become available to the wind. That is the difference. Dirt sitting in a field is one thing. Dirt loosened, dried, stripped of roots, and laid bare across millions of acres is another. The land had lost its grip on itself. Native prairie grasses, the old grasses that had grown there before the ploughs came, had held the plains with deep root systems adapted to drought and wind. When large stretches of that grass were ploughed under for wheat, and grazing pressure damaged other areas, the surface became much more vulnerable. The Library of Congress describes the land as over-farmed and overgrazed when drought began in 1930, and once the winds crossed those exposed fields, the soil began to blow away. Now, I want you to picture the first time a farmer sees his own field move. Not someone else's land, not a photograph in a newspaper, his own. The field he broke, seeded, worried over, borrowed against, walked across in the morning and again in the evening. Maybe he notices it first at the edge where the soil is finer. Maybe a little whirl of dust twists up and vanishes. Then another. Then the whole top layer seems to shiver. The wind comes harder and the loose earth begins sliding, then lifting, then flowing over itself like dark water. A person can understand crop failure. A person can understand poor yields. A person can understand a field that does not produce. But a field leaving the farm is something else entirely. It must have been difficult to find words for that. Farmers are practical people. They do not usually speak in grand phrases while standing in a ruined field. They say it is blowing. They say we lost topsoil. They say the north field is bad. They say the road drifted shut. They say there is dirt in the well house. They say we will have to clear the fence, but underneath those plain words sits something much larger. The topsoil was not just material. It was the memory of weather, grass, roots, seasons, decay, and time. It had taken nature far longer to make than it took the wind to carry off. When it lifted, it was not just this year's crop in danger. It was years of future crops, future payments, future meals, future children working that same land, all becoming less certain by the hour. And here is something that is easy to miss from the outside. Soil is not all the same. To a person who has never farmed, dirt can seem like dirt. It is brown, it is underfoot, it gets on shoes, and there is always more of it somewhere. But to a farmer, good soil is a living storehouse. It has texture, it has body, it holds moisture in one way if it is healthy, and in another way if it is worn out. It can be too sandy, too heavy, too dry, too tight, too loose. It can crust after rain, crack after heat, blow after drought. The best layer, the layer that feeds crops, is not something you can simply replace after it disappears. You can buy seed, you can repair a plough, you can patch a roof. You cannot quickly rebuild a landscape. The plains had always known wind, but before the great breaking of the grass, wind had less loose material to take. This did not mean the old prairie never suffered drought or dust. It did. The region was naturally dry, and severe drought had visited the plains long before the 1930s. But the scale of exposure had changed. Deep ploughing and the removal of natural grasses left huge areas without the old anchors that held the soil in place. The National Weather Service explains the Dust Bowl storms as the result of drought combined with the way the land had been ploughed. leaving little topsoil held in place once the natural grasses were gone. Let us bring this down from the scale of maps and agencies into one morning. The family wakes before sunrise because farm life does not pause for disaster. The mother lights the stove or works with what fire she has. The father steps outside to check the sky, the animals, the yard. The air is already moving, not violently yet, just enough to put a taste in the mouth. Dust has a taste. People who lived through those years remembered that. It was not merely something seen. It was felt on the tongue, between the teeth, in the corners of the eyes, at the back of the throat. A child coughs in bed. Another one rubs his eyes and is told not to rub, because rubbing makes it worse. Someone has left a cup uncovered overnight, and there is a brown ring inside it. Outside, the yard has changed while everyone slept. A small drift has formed against the step. The fence line has caught soil like a net. A bucket left near the barn has a layer in the bottom. Not rainwater, not feed, but earth. The father walks toward the field and his boots sink slightly where the dust is gathered. That may sound soft, almost harmless, but it is not. It means the land is no longer where it belongs. It is collecting in the wrong places. It is burying what should remain clear and exposing what should remain covered. The road into town may be difficult to travel. A car engine does not like dust. It clogs air filters, works into machinery, damages moving parts, coats oil, and makes every trip feel uncertain. Horses and mules suffer too. Their nostrils fill, their eyes water. Their feed is dusty unless it has been protected. A farmer depending on animals has to keep them alive through conditions the land itself is no longer helping him survive. Even opening a barn door during a blowing day can feel like surrendering one more interior space to the outside. Now, imagine the schoolhouse. Children had to keep going to school when they could, because childhood did not become suspended just because the weather turned hostile. They arrived with dust on their clothes and dust in their hair. Some may have carried cloths to hold over their faces when storms came. A teacher might stand at the front of a one-room schoolhouse and continue lessons while the light outside took on that strange brown cast. She would know, as the children knew, that if the sky darkened badly enough, someone might have to decide whether to send them home early or keep them inside. Sending them home could be dangerous if the road disappeared in dust. Keeping them inside could frighten them if the storm grew loud and the windows turned black. This was not the kind of decision a teacher had trained for in a normal school, but on the plains in the 1930s, ordinary people became emergency managers without being given the title. The day the soil started moving was not one day, of course. It happened in different places at different times. For some, the realization came in 1931. For others, 1932, 1933, 1934, or later. But every family reached a version of that day. The day when dust stopped being a nuisance and became evidence. The day someone said, "This is not normal," and no one laughed. The day the old explanations began to feel too small. The day the wind carried enough of the farm away that even the most stubborn person in the house had to admit that waiting for rain would not be enough. I want to pause on that phrase. Waiting for rain would not be enough. Because rain, for all its importance, could not easily undo what the wind had already begun doing. Rain could settle dust. It could bring temporary relief. It could make people cry with gratitude when it finally came. But if the soil structure was damaged, if the ground was bare, if the next dry spell returned, if farming continued in the same way, then the land remained vulnerable. Families were beginning to face a difficult truth that public officials and soil experts would soon make central to reform. This was not only a drought problem, it was a land use problem. And land use problems are more painful because they ask people not only to endure the sky, but to reconsider what they have done with their own hands. That kind of reconsideration is hard. Imagine telling a farmer who has spent years breaking sod, buying machinery, planting wheat, and trying to feed a family that the very work he believed proved his worth has helped expose him to ruin. That is not an easy message to hear. It can sound like accusation, even when it is meant as explanation. and many farmers had not acted alone. The government had encouraged settlement, railroads had advertised opportunity, banks had financed expansion, markets had rewarded wheat, wartime demand had pushed production, communities had celebrated acres under cultivation as signs of progress. So when the dust rose, blame did not sit neatly on one doorstep. It spread across policy, economy, weather, culture, and need. Still, the dust itself did not care about fairness. It moved because conditions allowed it to move, and once it began, it created its own routines. Families learned to read the horizon. They learned which doors leaked worst. They learned to place damp sheets over windows and sometimes over beds. They learned that a clean house could become dirty again in minutes. They learned to cover food immediately. They learned that sweeping during a storm was almost pointless, but not sweeping afterward made the house unlivable. They learned that a lamp could glow dim and brown in the middle of the afternoon. They learned that laughter helped sometimes, and other times laughter would not come. There is a story repeated in many Dust Bowl accounts about people setting the table, with plates turned upside down until the food was ready. The image has lasted because it tells the whole domestic story in one motion. You protect the plate from the air inside your own home. You cannot trust the room. You cannot trust the cupboard. You cannot trust the table between the time you set it and the time your family sits down. And when the meal begins, there is still grit. In the bread, in the beans, in the coffee, in the butter if you have butter. A person can become used to many things, but becoming used to chewing dust with supper must have carried a particular quiet humiliation. The mother in that house is important here, because much of the disaster entered family life through her labour. The field might belong legally to the father, or to the bank, or to the family in some complicated mix of paper and pride, but the dust made its daily invasion through the spaces women were expected to maintain. A clean kitchen mattered. Clean bedding mattered. Clean children mattered. A covered water pail mattered. Laundry mattered, even when hanging clothes outside seemed foolish and drying them inside left them stiff or smoky or still faintly gritty. Her work became defensive. She was not only cooking and washing and mending, she was resisting the collapse of the boundary between home and storm. And the children watched. That may be the most overlooked part of this moment. Children saw the soil move before they fully understood what it meant. They saw their parents' faces change. They saw animals grow thin. They saw dust drifts where there should have been yard. They saw school cancelled or shortened or made strange by storms. They heard new words: relief, foreclosure, auction, migration, California. They may have kept playing because children play in almost every disaster humans have ever endured, but play becomes different when the world around it feels unstable. A child might build a little road in the dust by the house, not knowing that the real road west would soon shape the family's future. The government noticed too, but government attention moved through reports, hearings, agencies and policies, while families were living storm by storm. Soil conservation had advocates before the worst years, but the disaster gave their warnings an audience that could no longer ignore them. Hugh Hammond Bennett, one of the leading voices for soil conservation, argued that erosion was not a minor farm issue but a national problem. In 1935, during the Dust Bowl crisis, the United States passed the Soil Conservation Act, which led to the creation of the Soil Conservation Service, the agency that later became the Natural Resources Conservation Service. But in the farmhouse, 1935 legislation is not yet relief. A law passed far away does not immediately clear the air from a child's lungs or put topsoil back on the North Field. It may matter greatly over time, and it did, but the people inside the storm lived inside the delay between recognition and rescue. That delay is where so much suffering happens. The experts begin to understand, the newspapers begin to name it, the government begins to respond, and meanwhile a woman is shaking dust from a sheet for the third time that day. By the mid-1930s, dust storms had become a repeated part of life in many areas. Dodge City, Kansas, recorded numerous days of dense and light dust in March and April 1935, just before and during the period of the famous Black Sunday storm. Those numbers matter because they remind us that the worst remembered storm was part of a larger pattern, not an isolated accident. People were not shocked by dust because they had never seen it. They were worn down by seeing it again and again. Think about the difference between fear and exhaustion. Fear is sharp. It wakes the body. It makes people run, close doors, gather children, shout instructions. Exhaustion comes later, after the 10th storm, the 20th, the season of storms, the year when dust is no longer an event but a condition. A family can be brave during one emergency. It is much harder to remain brave when the emergency becomes the climate of daily life. Dust storms did not only damage farms, they changed the emotional weather inside homes. They made people irritable, quiet, watchful, and sometimes ashamed. There is a shame that comes with being unable to keep clean, unable to keep land, unable to protect children from something as basic as air. And still, the soil moved. It moved across fields, roads, porches, rail lines, and town streets. It moved into church pews and store counters. It moved into courthouse offices and bank lobbies. It got into envelopes, drawers, hymnals, ledgers, school books. It made no distinction between careful families and careless ones, between people who had prayed and people who had not, between those who owned land and those who rented it. Of course, money could soften some parts of the suffering. A better house might seal more tightly. A family with savings could buy feed longer. A person with connections might leave sooner. But the dust itself had a terrible democracy. It entered wherever wind could carry it. The phrase, "the day the soil started moving," also asks us to think about scale. A handful of soil blowing from one field is a problem. Millions of acres blowing becomes a national event. Dust from the plains did not always stay local. Storms carried soil long distances, sometimes far beyond the farms where it began. Reports from the era describe dust reaching cities far from the plains, reminding Americans who lived nowhere near the devastated farms that the country's land problem could travel. The Dust Bowl became visible to people who might otherwise have dismissed it as a rural misfortune. When dirt from one region darkens the sky of another, the idea of separate problems becomes harder to maintain. There is something almost unbearable about the intimacy of the loss. A farmer may not know which particles in the storm came from his own field. That may sound like a strange thought, but imagine it. The air is full of soil from everywhere, mixed beyond recognition. Your land and your neighbour's land and land from counties away swirl together in the same brown cloud. Property lines vanish in the air. The field that was surveyed, fenced, mortgaged, taxed, inherited and loved becomes part of a moving mass that belongs to no one. The paperwork still says the land is yours, but some portion of it is passing over the roof and into the next county. At night, the dust could make the house feel smaller. Darkness was already part of rural life, but dust darkness was different. It could arrive at noon. It could turn a day wrong. The family gathers inside, not in the warm, firelit closeness of some older rural memory, but in a strained closeness, listening. Wind against walls, sand-like tapping at windows, a loose board knocking somewhere outside, a child asking if it is night, a parent saying no, not exactly, the lamp burning though it should not be needed yet. Dust making a halo around the flame, the room smelling of kerosene, cloth, dry earth, and fear that no one wants to name. The father may still go out if he has to. Animals do not stop needing care because the air has turned dangerous. He ties a cloth around his face. He lowers his hat. He moves by memory from house to barn because sight is unreliable. This is where the familiar farm becomes strange. A man who knows every gate and post can still become disoriented when visibility falls. The world is reduced to a few feet of brown motion. The barn appears only when he's nearly upon it. The animals shift and complain inside. He checks water, feed, doors and latches, doing small necessary acts while the larger situation remains beyond his control. Inside, the mother tries to keep the children calm. Perhaps she gives them tasks. Hold this cloth. Sit away from the window. Do not open the door. Keep your brother with you. She may speak firmly because firmness is useful when comfort would sound false. She may be frightened too, but there is not much space for her fear. Someone has to keep the house operating even when the day has become unnatural. That is one of the quiet burdens of domestic life in disaster. The ordinary tasks continue, and their continuation becomes a form of courage no one applauds. When the storm eases, there is no clean ending. That is another thing modern people may not understand. The wind drops, perhaps. The light returns slowly. A rooster might crow as if morning has come twice. People open doors cautiously. The world outside has been rearranged. Drifts lie where paths used to be. Dust covers the porch. The fence may be half buried in places. A car left outside looks abandoned even if it was driven yesterday. The field is changed again, though the full damage may take time to understand. Then the cleaning begins, not recovery. Cleaning. The first, smallest, most immediate response to catastrophe. Someone shakes bedding. Someone sweeps. Someone coughs. Someone checks livestock. Someone clears the doorstep. Someone tries to save machinery from grit. Someone looks at the wheat and says nothing. Silence after a dust storm may have been one of the heaviest sounds on the plains. What is there to say when the evidence is under your fingernails and in your lungs? And yet people did speak. They wrote letters. They gave interviews later. They told children and grandchildren. They described storms that made noon black, dust that sifted through walls, drifts like snow, and the feeling that the end of the world had come in brown air. Those memories matter because numbers alone cannot hold this history. Acres lost, counties affected, migrants counted, agencies created, all of that is necessary. But none of it tells you what it was like to lift a cup to your mouth and taste the farm in it. So the soil moving was the moment when the disaster became visible in a new way. Drought could be denied for a while as a season. Low prices could be blamed on markets. Debt could be postponed with hope. But moving soil was hard to argue with. It was the land physically demonstrating that the arrangement had failed. It crossed the boundary between private worry and public crisis. It turned fields into weather. It made agriculture airborne. And as the family stands in the yard after another storm, as the father looks at the drifts, as the mother sees what has entered the house, as the children step carefully through dust that was supposed to be a crop field, one thought begins to settle over them. Not all at once, not in a sentence perhaps, but in the body. If the soil can move, then everything else can move too. The household can move. The animals can be sold. The furniture can be auctioned. The children can be taken out of school. The family name that once belonged to a place can become a name on the road. But before that road appears, before the car is packed and the neighbours watch from their porches, there are the storms themselves, the days when the sky turns black and a normal home becomes a shelter under attack from the very land around it. There is the hour when someone sees the wall coming, when every door must be shut, every crack stuffed, every child brought close, every breath made smaller. And inside that darkened house, with dust pressing at the windows and the sun disappearing in the middle of the day, the Dust Bowl stops being something happening to the farm and becomes something happening inside the family's lungs. And inside that darkened house, with dust pressing at the windows and the sun disappearing in the middle of the day, the Dust Bowl stops being something happening to the farm and becomes something happening inside the family's lungs. That is the part that is hardest to explain unless you slow the whole scene down and let yourself stand in that room with them. Because a black blizzard was not just a storm you watched from behind glass. It was not like a thunderstorm, where you might stand at the window and count the seconds after lightning. It was not like a snowstorm, where the world becomes quiet and white and strangely beautiful, even if the cold is dangerous. A black blizzard was an invasion. It was weather made of the farm itself. It crossed the field, crossed the yard, hit the house, and then, even with every door closed and every window stuffed and every prayer said under someone's breath, it came inside. Let us begin just before it arrives. The family has already seen the warning. Maybe the father saw the wolf first from the barnyard. Maybe one of the children was outside and came running in with the kind of panic that makes words come out in pieces. Maybe the mother noticed the light change before anyone said anything, that strange yellow-brown dimming that made afternoon feel wrong. People who live through these storms often describe the sight in practical terms: a cloud on the horizon, a bank of dust, a black line, a rolling wall. It could look at first like a storm cloud sitting too low, but then it moved like something with weight behind it. A solid front of dust pushed by hard wind across land that had nothing left to hold it down. In a normal storm, a person might take a moment to look. In a dust storm, looking was a luxury. The house had to be prepared quickly. Windows were shut if they were open. Doors were checked. Cracks were stuffed with rags, towels, old clothing, newspaper, anything that might slow the dust. Wet sheets might be hung over windows or doors because damp cloth could trap some of the grit before it entered the room. If there was laundry hanging outside, someone might try to grab it, unless the storm was already too close. If small children were in the yard, they were pulled inside fast. If animals were loose, there might not be time to do much more than hope they found shelter. That is one of the cruel details of a black blizzard. Every response was incomplete. You could close the house, but not seal it. You could bring the children inside, but not give them clean air. You could cover the food, but not protect it perfectly. You could bank the stove, trim the lamp, wet the cloths, gather the family, and still the storm would find its way through. A farmhouse was not built like a laboratory. It had boards that had shifted with weather, windows that did not fit tightly, doors with gaps along the bottom, chimneys, seams, keyholes, and all the ordinary imperfections of a working rural home. The Dust Bowl turned every imperfection into an opening. Now picture the mother in that room. I keep coming back to her because the storm meets her first through the work of keeping a home functioning. She may be in the kitchen when the light begins to fail. Supper may not be ready. Bread may be covered under a cloth. There may be beans on the stove or potatoes, or coffee that will taste like dust no matter how carefully it is protected. She moves quickly, not dramatically because there is no time for drama. She turns plates upside down. She covers the water pail. She checks the baby if there is a baby. She tells one child to stay away from the door, another to help with cloths, another to fetch something from the back room. Her voice has to carry authority without frightening them too much, which is one of the old exhausting skills of parenthood during danger. The father, if he is outside when the storm hits, may come in with dust already on his face. Not a little dust, not the harmless dirt of a farm chore, but a coating that makes his features look older and harsher. His eyes water. He spits grit from his mouth. He may have wrapped a bandana or handkerchief over his nose and mouth, but the dust still gets in. It gets under the cloth, around the cloth, through the cloth. The body was not designed to filter a field. He closes the door behind him, and even that movement brings in a rush of dust that the mother may look at with frustration she cannot afford to express. No one is to blame for opening the door. The door has to open. People have to come in. The storm takes advantage of every necessary act. Then the darkness thickens. This is the detail that made black blizzards feel almost unnatural. Noon could become night, not the comfortable darkness of evening, when a lamp is lit and everyone knows where the sun has gone, but a sudden darkening that tells the body something is wrong. Chickens might go to roost. Cows might turn their backs to the wind. In town, streetlights might come on if there were streetlights to come on. In the farmhouse, the family reaches for a kerosene lamp in the middle of the day. The lamp gives a dull, brownish light, not clear enough to restore normal life, just enough to show faces, hands, the edge of the table, dust moving in the air like smoke, and the sound. We need to talk about the sound because photographs cannot give it to you. The wind does not merely blow, it presses. It rattles windows, pushes against walls, moans under eaves, and drives fine particles against the glass with a dry, steady hiss. Loose boards complain, doors tremble. The house creaks in a way that makes it feel less like shelter and more like something struggling to remain whole. If a tin roof is involved, the noise can become sharp and restless. If something outside has come loose, a bucket, a shutter, a piece of scrap metal, the repeated banging can work on the nerves until someone wants to shout just to break the rhythm. Inside, people speak differently. They speak closer to one another. They speak less. Dust makes the mouth dry. It makes the throat raw. It makes every sentence feel like a small physical effort. The children may ask questions at first. How long will it last? Is it night? Can we go outside after? Will the animals be all right? Is the schoolhouse in the dark too? A parent answers what can be answered and avoids what cannot. The truth is that no one knows exactly how long it will last. Some storms passed in hours. Others left dust hanging and blowing for much longer. And even when the worst of the wall moved on, the house remained filled with what it had brought. A small child begins to cough. That sound changes the room. Adults can be brave about property longer than they can be brave about children struggling to breathe. The mother may tie a damp cloth over the child's nose and mouth. She may hold the child close, partly to comfort, partly to keep the cloth in place. Another child may resist because the cloth feels suffocating. Someone tells him to keep it on. Not gently now, perhaps. Not because they are unkind, but because fear makes commands sharper. The dust is not only unpleasant, it is dangerous. It can irritate lungs, bring fever, worsen existing illness, and in the worst cases contribute to what people call dust pneumonia. Families in the Dust Bowl knew that children, the elderly, and the already sick were vulnerable. They did not need a medical lecture to understand it. They could hear it in the cough. Try to imagine the helplessness of that. You have brought your child inside, and inside is still not safe. You have shut the door, but the air is still wrong. You have wet cloths, but they dry out. You have water, but it must be rationed and protected. You may not have a doctor nearby, and if you do, travel during the storm may be impossible. A parent in that room is forced to do what parents in hard times have so often done: perform small acts of care against a problem too large to solve. Hold the cloth, wipe the eyes, offer water, keep the child still, speak calmly, listen to the wind. Meanwhile, dust settles everywhere. It does not wait until the storm ends. It collects while the family is sitting there. It lies on the table, on the stove, on the bed, on the shelf, on the baby's blanket, on the man's hat, on the mother's hair. If someone runs a finger across a surface, a line appears immediately. If food is uncovered for even a short time, it is no longer clean. Flour, sugar, salt, coffee, everything has to be protected, and even then the protection is imperfect. The family may eat later that day because people must eat, but the meal will include grit. That is not a metaphor. They will chew tiny particles of the land with whatever food they have. There is something deeply humiliating about dirt in food. We do not talk about that enough. Hunger is terrible, but food made gritty by dust carries another insult. It says the household has been breached. It says the mother's labour cannot win. It says the farm is no longer feeding the family in the way it was supposed to. It is entering their mouths in a form that gives no nourishment. Imagine a child complaining that the bread is dirty and a mother having no clean answer except to say eat it anyway. Not because she does not care, because there may not be another loaf. The animals remain in everyone's mind. Even inside the house, the family is thinking about the barn, horses, mules, cows, chickens. Pigs if they still have them. Animals are property, yes, but on a farm they're also daily companions in the work of survival. Their suffering matters because it is practical and emotional at the same time. A cow that cannot breathe well, a horse with dust in its eyes, chickens smothered or confused by darkness. All of this becomes part of the family's fear. But going out during the worst of the storm may be too dangerous. so the father waits or tries to wait. He may stand near the door, listening, judging whether he can make it to the barn. The mother may tell him not yet. He may go anyway. That walk from house to barn, which on a clear morning takes less than a minute, becomes a passage through a world without distances. The yard disappears. The barn disappears until he is nearly at it. The wind pushes dust into his face so hard he has to turn partly away. He keeps one hand out, perhaps following a fence or a rope if the family has strung one for safety in bad storms. Some families used guide ropes between buildings because visibility could fall so low that even familiar ground became dangerous. It sounds extreme until you remember that in a black blizzard, a person could become lost between house and barn on his own farm. Inside the barn, the air is not clean, only less violent. The animals shift in stalls. Their breathing may sound rough. Dust lies on their backs. Water tanks may be dirty. Feed may need covering. The father does what he can quickly. He checks doors, latches, water, and the animals that matter most. He's not solving the storm. He's buying survival in small pieces. Then he returns to the house, carrying more dust on his clothes, his hands, his face, his eyelashes. When he steps inside, the mother sees at once whether the news is bad, because farm families learned to read news before words were spoken. The children will remember this if they live long enough. They may remember the lamp burning at noon. They may remember their mother's hand pressing a cloth to their face. They may remember being told not to cry because crying made breathing harder. They may remember the taste of dust in milk, or the way the room turned dark before dinner. Childhood memories are often built from fragments, and Dust Bowl childhoods carried fragments like these, not always in full explanation. A child does not understand erosion policy or wheat prices. A child understands that the sun disappeared and adults were afraid. And there were many such children. Some families stayed through repeated storms, through years when dust became part of growing up. Their children learned a strange normal. They learned not to leave things uncovered. They learned to shake out bedding before sleep. They learned that a cough could frighten adults. They learned that weather could enter the house. They learned that school might be interrupted by darkness in the afternoon. They learned to be quiet when their parents listened for the wind. In town, the black blizzard entered differently, but no less completely. Storekeepers tried to protect goods on shelves. Clerks covered displays. Banks, already symbols of anxiety for many families, filled with dust like anywhere else. Doctors' offices saw people with irritated eyes and lungs. Schools held children until it seemed safe. Churches, if a storm came during a service or meeting, became shelters of a kind, with people waiting together under a dim interior light while dust struck the windows. A town could disappear inside its own street grid. Buildings across the road became shapes, then shadows, then nothing. What did people do while waiting? This question matters because disaster is not all motion. Much of it is waiting under pressure. Some prayed. Some sat silently. Some tried to continue useful work, mending, sorting, cleaning, tending a stove, because doing something can keep fear from taking over the room. Some told children stories. Some watched the window even though there was nothing to see. Some listened to the radio if the signal held and the set was working, trying to hear news from beyond the storm, but a radio voice from far away could not change the air in the room. The storm also created a strange kind of intimacy. The family was forced close, but not in a cosy way. They were close because the safer spaces were limited. They were close because light was limited. They were close because children needed to be watched, cloths wetted, doors guarded, and panic kept down. In that closeness, roles became clear. The mother managed the interior defence. The father managed the outside risks if he could. Older children became helpers, not because childhood had ended, but because emergencies do not wait for childhood to be convenient. A girl might help keep smaller children calm. A boy might be told to hold a door closed, fetch water, or help his father later clear a drift. These children were not being prepared for hardship in theory. They were inside it. And still the dust kept entering. Through keyholes, through window frames, through cracks in the floor, through the roof if it found a way. It came so fine that it seemed almost intelligent. You might stuff a gap and find another. You might wipe a surface and watch it dull again. People sometimes describe dust sifting into houses like flour. That comparison is useful because flour is familiar, but it is too clean. Flour belongs in a kitchen. Dust in a black blizzard carried the field, the road, manure, chaff, dried weeds, and the residue of a damaged landscape. It was not sterile. It was not symbolic. It was material that the body had to confront. Breathing became labour. Think about that. Most of us live with the assumption that breathing is automatic and invisible. During a black blizzard, breathing moved into awareness. You felt it. You managed it. You protected it with cloth. You noticed when it became difficult. A person sitting quietly in a chair could be exhausted by air. That is a frightening reversal. The thing that should sustain you becomes something you must guard against. By late afternoon, if the storm had come earlier, the household sense of time might be completely distorted. Is it evening now? Has the sun set? Or is the dust still blocking it? Should supper be made? Should chores be attempted? Can anyone go outside? Is the worst over? In rural life, time is usually connected to light, animals, meals, and work. A black blizzard scrambled those signals. Lamps were lit too early. Chickens behaved as though night had arrived. Children became tired at the wrong hour. Adults delayed tasks until they could see, then had to do them in haste when the storm eased. When the dust finally begins to thin, the room does not become clean. It becomes visible. That is different. The family can see what the storm has done. The lamp is still burning, but now the shapes of furniture return. The window shows a dim outside rather than a flat brown darkness. Someone opens the door carefully, and dust piled against it may push inward. The porch is covered. The yard has new drifts. The fence line looks lower. The path to the barn may need to be shoveled as if after a snowstorm, except this snow is soil, and shoveling it feels like moving the farm one more time by hand. Inside, the cleaning begins, and it is almost beyond comprehension how discouraging that must have been. Every surface, every dish, every bed, every windowsill, every shelf, clothing shaken, bedding beaten, floors swept, dust carried out in pans or pushed through doors, only for some of it to blow back. The mother may be too tired to feel anger in a loud way. Her anger might be quiet, folded into the motion of wiping the same table again. Her back aches, her throat hurts, her eyes burn. And there will still be supper to manage, children to settle, laundry to consider, the next day to prepare for. Disaster did not excuse domestic labour, it multiplied it. Outside, the men begin the other cleaning, clearing doors, checking machinery, digging out fence lines, looking for animals, inspecting fields, though the inspection may offer nothing but confirmation. A tractor exposed to dust needs attention. A car engine may need cleaning. Wells and water sources have to be checked. If dust has drifted into feed, animals may refuse it or suffer from it. If chickens have died, they must be removed. If a calf is sick, it must be handled. If the barn door was damaged, it must be repaired before the next wind. There is always a next wind in the mind, even if the sky is cleared for the moment. The emotional aftermath may be the hardest part to see. People did not always have the language to say, "I am afraid of the next storm. I cannot stand the sound of wind anymore. I feel trapped in my own house. I am ashamed that my children are breathing this." Instead, they said practical things. We need more cloth for the windows. The cow looks poorly. The road may be blocked. The well cover needs checking. We should sweep before bed. Practical speech can carry unbearable feeling if you listen closely. A black blizzard also forced people to confront the limits of individual effort. This is central to the Dust Bowl story. American farm culture valued self-reliance, and not without reason. A farm family had to know how to fix, grow, preserve, improvise, endure, and keep going with little help. But a dust storm did not respect self-reliance. You could be hard-working, careful, moral, skilled, and frugal, and still the dust came in. You could stuff every crack and still cough. You could save seed and still lose the field. You could pray and still watch the sky turn black. That realization did something to people. It challenged not only their finances, but their deepest ideas about control. And yet, they did keep going, at least for a while. After the storm, someone made coffee if there was coffee. Someone fed the children. Someone checked on neighbours. This mattered. Isolation could be deadly, and neighbourly checking became a quiet lifeline. Was anyone sick? Did anyone get caught outside? Were animals lost? Was a road passable? Did the school dismiss children safely? Did an elderly couple need help clearing their doorway? Rural communities were not perfect, and hardship could create resentment as well as kindness. But during storms, people often understood that survival was shared. The dust crossed property lines, and so did concern. Imagine a neighbour arriving after the storm, face still dirty, hat in hand, not making a speech. He asks if everyone is all right. The father says yes, mostly. The mother says the baby coughed hard. They discuss whose field blew worst without saying too directly what that means. They mention a family down the road thinking of leaving. They stand in the yard looking at dust piled against the house. No one has much comfort to offer. Sometimes presence is the only comfort available. At night, after a black blizzard, the house may finally grow quiet, but not peaceful. Dust remains in the beds no matter how well they are shaken. A child may cough in sleep. The mother may wake at every change in the wind. The father may lie awake thinking of debt, fields, livestock, and whether this storm has ended any chance of a crop. The lamp is out now, or turned low. The room is darker than during the storm, but the darkness is honest darkness, the kind that belongs to night. Still, the house does not feel fully safe. Once the outside has entered so completely, trust does not return quickly. This is why the black blizzard belongs at the centre of the story. It made visible what had been happening slowly. The drought was in the field, the prices were in the ledger, the debt was in the bank office, the erosion was in the soil, but the black blizzard brought all of it into the kitchen, the bed, the lungs, the cup, the child's cough. It removed the distance between environmental damage and domestic life. It told every person in the house that the crisis was not somewhere out there on the land. It was here, in the room where they ate and slept. And once that had happened often enough, the question changed. It was no longer simply, will the rain come? It became, how many more storms can we live through? How much soil can leave before the farm is not a farm? How many times can we clean the house, treat the cough, comfort the children, clear the door, repair the machinery, and tell ourselves we are staying? How long can a family remain rooted when the ground itself will not? Morning after such a storm could be strangely bright. That was another cruelty. The sun might rise clear, shining over a landscape rearranged by damage. The sky could look innocent. Birds might move again. The wind might rest. From a distance, the day might even seem calm. But the family knew what the calm contained. They stepped outside and saw the drifts, the buried fence, the coated machinery, the field cut thinner by the wind. They carried bedding out to shake it. They wiped dishes again. They checked the animals again. They returned to the routines that made life possible, but the routines now had a question underneath them. Because a black blizzard did not only pass over a family, it changed what they believed the next day might require. It made every ordinary possession feel less secure. A house could be invaded, a field could move, a child could become ill from air, animals could weaken inside a barn, machinery could fail from dust, roads could vanish, neighbours could leave. And if all of that was true, then the farm was no longer the stable centre of life it had once seemed to be. It was becoming a place where survival required constant defence. So when people later said they lost everything during the Dust Bowl, we should remember that everything was not lost all at once. Some of it was lost in rooms like this, during storms like this, in the hours when parents held cloth over children's faces and listened to their own land strike the windows. Some of it was lost in the repeated cleaning that never restored cleanliness. Some of it was lost in the first cough that did not go away. Some of it was lost when a father returned from the barn and did not meet his wife's eyes quickly enough. Some of it was lost when children stopped being surprised by darkness at noon. And after the storm, once the air cleared enough to see the yard again, the family still had to face the rest of the farm. The dust in the house was only the part that had crossed the threshold. Beyond the door were the crops that had failed or never risen, the animals that needed feed no one could easily provide, the banknote waiting in town, and the slow, practical dismantling of a life that had once seemed hard but possible. The black blizzard made the disaster visible inside the home, but the next losses came through the things families depended on to stay alive. The wheat, the cow, the mule, the seed, the machinery, and the money that was supposed to come when harvest did. The black blizzard made the disaster visible inside the home, but the next losses came through the things families depended on to stay alive. The wheat, the cow, the mule, the seed, the machinery, and the money that was supposed to come when harvest did. That is where the Dust Bowl becomes harder to watch, because dust storms were terrifying, but they were not the only thing taking people apart. A storm could pass in an afternoon. A failed crop stayed failed. A banknote stayed due. A dead animal did not come back when the sky cleared. The damage that began in the air settled into ledgers, barns, kitchens, and auction yards. It moved from weather into property, from property into debt, and from debt into the question no farm family wanted to ask aloud. How much of this place can disappear before we have to admit that we are already gone? Let us begin in the field, because everything in this part of the story begins there. A wheat field in trouble does not always look dramatic at first. It may simply look thin, uneven, a little late. The farmer walks between rows and bends down, rubbing the dry soil between his fingers. He checks the roots. He looks at the colour of the leaves. He knows what he wants to see, and he knows what he is seeing instead. The wheat should be pushing upward. It should be thick enough that the field begins to look like one continuous surface. It should have the green confidence of a crop with water under it. Instead, there are bare spaces. Weak stems, soil-crusted then broken by wind, plants that started and stopped, plants that never came at all. A farmer can lie to other people more easily than he can lie to himself in a field. He may tell a neighbour it is not too bad yet. He may tell his wife that one rain could still help. He may tell the banker that the crop has a chance. But alone among the rows, he knows. The land has a language, and he has spent years learning it. The leaves tell him. The soil tells him. The way the wind moves over the surface tells him. And by the middle of the worst Dust Bowl years, many fields were not simply disappointing. They were failing outright. Seed went into the ground and nothing worth harvesting came back. Wheat shriveled before maturity. Corn withered. Gardens burned. Pastures thinned until livestock had almost nothing to graze. The farm economy did not collapse in one clean motion. It failed through 1,000 small observations that became harder and harder to deny. Now this is where I want you to understand the arithmetic of that failure. For a farm family, a crop was not just food. It was not even just income. It was the point around which the whole year was arranged. The crop was how the family expected to pay the mortgage or rent. It was how seed loans were repaid. It was how machinery debt was handled. It was how store credit in town was settled. It was how taxes were paid. It was how shoes were bought for children before school. It was how the doctor might be paid if someone got sick. It was how feed might be purchased if the pasture was poor. So when the crop failed, it did not remove one thing from the family's life. It removed the answer to nearly every question. Picture the kitchen table again, late in the evening after the dust has settled enough for the lamp to be turned low. There may be a ledger on the table, or just envelopes, bills, notices, scraps of paper with figures written in pencil. Farm families often kept careful accounts because they had to. A few dollars mattered. A missed payment mattered. The father's hands may still have dust in the cracks of the skin. The mother's hands may be red from washing and work. They sit across from each other, not speaking much, because numbers do not become better if you talk over them. They know what is owed. They know what the crop might bring if there is a crop. They know what the wheat price was the last time someone checked in town. They know which animals can be sold and which cannot. They know what has already been stretched, delayed, patched, and promised. This is one of the quiet cruelties of the Dust Bowl. The disaster arrived during the Great Depression, when prices had already turned against farmers. If wheat had been selling high, some families might have survived a bad year with less damage. If credit had been easy and banks secure, some might have borrowed their way through the drought long enough to recover. If wages in town were steady, a farmer might have worked elsewhere for a season and kept the place afloat. But the Depression narrowed every escape route. Wheat prices fell. Banks failed or tightened credit. People who might have bought livestock or equipment had little money themselves. Stores could not extend credit forever. Neighbours who might have helped were often in trouble too. The whole structure of rural exchange became brittle. A crop failure in a healthy economy is serious. A crop failure in a depressed economy is a trap. And that trap caught families who had not been careless, who had not lived extravagantly, who had not imagined themselves rich. Many had borrowed because borrowing was how farming worked. Land had to be bought or leased. Equipment had to be purchased. Seed had to be obtained before harvest could produce income. A tractor that looked like progress in 1928 could become a burden by 1933. A mortgage that seemed manageable when wheat prices were better could become impossible when the crop failed and the price collapsed. The bank did not need to hate the farmer to ruin him. It only needed to require payment when payment no longer existed. There is a phrase people used then and still use now, the bank came. It sounds almost simple. The bank came, as if a building picked itself up and walked down the road. What it really meant was that paper authority entered a place built by physical labour. A notice arrived. A banker or representative called. A conversation happened in an office or on a porch. A due date was not met. An extension was denied or granted only briefly. A mortgage was foreclosed. Property that had felt personal became collateral. Land that had held births, funerals, harvest suppers, broken machinery, childhood chores, and family arguments became an asset in default. Imagine the humiliation of that. A farmer who had spent years measuring himself by self-reliance now had to sit across from a banker and explain weather, prices, dust, dead wheat, and bad luck. The banker may have understood. He may even have been sympathetic. Many small-town bankers knew the families personally. They went to the same churches, read the same local papers, saw the same dust on their own windowsills. But sympathy did not create money. Banks were under pressure too. Depositors wanted funds. Loans had to be collected. A bank that allowed too many unpaid debts could fail, and bank failure would hurt the whole town. So the system did what systems often do in a crisis. It converted human suffering into procedures. Then came the auction. If you want to understand what losing everything looked like in public, stand at a farm auction in the Dust Bowl years. The family has already lost privately by then. They have had the kitchen conversations. They have sold what they could sell quietly. They have reduced meals. They have delayed purchases. They have patched shoes and harnesses and clothing. They have watched the crop fail and the animals weaken. By the time an auction is posted, loss has been moving through the house for months or years. But the auction takes that private loss and arranges it in the yard for everyone to see. The items are brought out and grouped. A plough, a harrow, harness, buckets, tools, a wagon, a stove perhaps, a bed frame, chairs, a table, maybe a sewing machine if there is one, jars, crocks, livestock if any remain worth selling, a mule, a milk cow, chickens. The family's belongings, which yesterday were simply the things of daily life, become objects with bids attached. Neighbours arrive. Some come because they need cheap goods. Some come because they are curious. Some come because there is a grim community obligation in witnessing a family's fall. Some may come hoping to quietly help by bidding and returning an item, though not everyone could afford such generosity. Children watch adults handle familiar things as if they have become merchandise. That is a hard lesson for a child. It teaches that home can be priced. The auctioneer's voice cuts through the air, fast, practiced, impersonal because it has to be. If he slowed down enough to feel every object, no auction could ever finish. A neighbour bids on the harness, another on the stove. Someone buys the cow. The father stands nearby, perhaps with his jaw tight, perhaps speaking to men as if this is only business. The mother may stay inside for some of it, or she may stand outside because pride will not let her hide. The children may be told to keep away, but children see more than adults intend. They see their mother's face when a familiar chair is carried off. They see their father pretending not to watch the tools. They see strangers or neighbours opening drawers, lifting lids, testing handles, judging the weight of things that used to belong without question to the family. There were places where communities resisted auctions, especially during the Depression, by holding what were sometimes called penny auctions. Neighbours would gather and bid only a few cents on foreclosed goods, then return the items to the original family, while making it clear that outside bidders were not welcome. These actions showed how deeply some rural people understood the violence of foreclosure. But penny auctions could not save everyone, and not every community could or would organise one. In many cases the sale went forward, and when it ended the family had less than they did that morning. But before many families reached that point, they had to face another loss, one that hurt in a different part of the heart. The animals. The Dust Bowl was not only a story of crops failing in fields. It was a story of barns becoming harder to keep alive. Livestock depended on feed, water, and pasture, and the drought attacked all three. Pastures dried out. Hay became scarce or expensive. Grain that might have fed animals was needed for people, or unavailable altogether. Water sources dropped or became dirty. Dust storms irritated animals' eyes and lungs. Cattle lost weight. Horses and mules weakened. Chickens laid less. Pigs became harder to feed. On a farm, animal suffering is never abstract. You hear it, you smell it, you carry water to it, you look it in the eye. A milk cow might be one of the last lines of defence against hunger. Milk could become cream, butter, cheese, if conditions allowed, or simply food for children. Selling the cow meant giving up daily nourishment. Keeping the cow meant finding feed and water. A team of horses or mules represented power, transportation, cultivation, hauling, the ability to keep working. Selling or losing them meant losing the ability to farm even if rain returned. Chickens provided eggs and occasionally meat. Pigs could turn scraps into pork, but only if there were scraps enough. Every animal on the farm had a place in the household economy, and during drought, every animal became a question. Let us stand in the barn on a dry evening. The air inside is warmer than it should be, dusty, carrying the smell of animals and old feed. The cow moves slowly. Her ribs show more than they did last season. The horse lowers his head. The feed bin is not empty, not yet, but low enough that everyone knows it. The father runs his hand along the animal's neck and feels bone where there used to be strength. A child may come in behind him and ask if the horse is sick. What can he say? Yes, in a way. Not sick like fever. Sick from a world that no longer has enough grass. Some families tried to keep animals alive long after it made financial sense because animals were not merely numbers. A horse that had worked beside a man for years was not easily reduced to a sale price. A cow with a name, milked by the same hands every morning, was not just livestock to the children. But drought is very good at forcing people to choose between sentiment and survival. Feed bought for an animal might mean less food bought for children. Keeping a weak animal might mean watching it suffer. Selling early might bring a little money. Waiting too long might mean the animal was worth almost nothing. These were not clean choices. They were choices that left a mark no matter which way a family turned. There were also jackrabbits, and I want to speak about them because they show the desperation of those years in a way that is difficult to forget. As drought damaged crops and vegetation, jackrabbit populations in some areas became a serious problem. They came in large numbers to feed on whatever remained in fields and gardens. Farmers already losing crops to drought and wind then had to watch animals devour what little might survive. In some communities, people organised jackrabbit drives. Men, women and children formed lines and drove the rabbits into pens or fenced areas, where they were killed in large numbers. It's an ugly image. It should be. It was ugly then too, but it came from desperation, from people trying to protect crops and gardens that stood between them and hunger. There were grasshoppers too, eating through already weakened fields. There were weeds that blew in and tumbleweeds that piled against fences and houses. There were cattle skulls and carcasses in the landscape, in places where animals could not be sustained. The Dust Bowl was not one disaster, but a crowd of disasters feeding each other. Drought weakened crops. Bare fields fed dust storms. Dust storms damaged health and machinery. Failed crops destroyed income. Lost income made feed impossible. Lack of feed killed animals or forced sales. Livestock loss reduced a family's ability to survive. Debt then came harder, and all of this happened while the country as a whole was struggling through economic collapse. The government did step in, and we should not ignore that. During the New Deal, federal relief programs tried to help farmers and rural families through loans, work programs, conservation efforts, and emergency livestock purchases. In some drought-stricken regions, the government bought starving cattle from farmers, sometimes slaughtering animals that were too weak to ship or use. This was relief, but it was a grim kind of relief. A farmer might receive money for cattle he could no longer feed, which could help the family survive a little longer, but the sale also confirmed the collapse of his herd. Imagine watching government men inspect animals that once represented your security and decide which were worth saving, which were worth shipping, and which should be destroyed. Relief can be necessary and still feel like defeat. Children remembered the animal losses. Of course they did. A child may not understand mortgage law, but a child understands when the cow is gone. A child understands when there are no eggs. A child understands when the family horse does not come back to the barn. Sometimes adults tried to soften the explanation. Sometimes there was no softening possible. The animal had been sold. The animal had died. The animal had to be shot. These moments entered family memory because they turned the disaster into something personal. Dust in the air was frightening, but the empty stall was proof. Inside the house, the food changed as crops and animals failed. Meals became simpler, thinner, more repetitive. Beans, bread, potatoes if there were potatoes, cornmeal, gravy when there was fat enough, coffee stretched, milk if the cow still gave it, canned goods from better seasons if any remained. Gardens were a lifeline for many families, but drought made gardens uncertain too. Women who had once taken pride in shelves of preserved food now counted jars with growing care. Every jar opened was one less buffer between the family and hunger. Every meal required calculation. What could be used now? What had to last? What could be fed to children first? What could be disguised as enough? The mother's work became a form of rationing as much as cooking. She might skim less cream because the children needed milk. She might make bread stretch further with gravy or beans. She might serve herself less without saying so. She might save scraps that once would have gone to chickens because there were fewer chickens, or because the scraps might flavour soup. There was skill in this, but skill did not remove the strain. It is possible to be very good at making do and still be exhausted by always making do. The father's work changed too. Farming is already uncertain, but during the Dust Bowl much of his labour became salvage. He was not only planting and harvesting, he was trying to prevent further loss. repairing fences half buried by dust, clearing drifts, protecting machinery, hauling water, searching for feed, meeting with creditors, applying for relief work, listening for weather, watching animals, deciding whether to plant again, deciding whether hope had become waste. The body still worked, but the purpose of the work had shifted. It was no longer building, it was holding. That difference matters. Building gives fatigue a direction. Holding against loss gives fatigue a different taste. A man can work 12 hours building a barn and feel tired, but satisfied because the barn stands higher at day's end. He can work 12 hours clearing dust from a doorway and know the next storm may put it back. He can plant seed and know the field may blow before it grows. He can bargain with the bank and know the numbers still may not work. This kind of labour wears on the spirit because it produces so little visible progress. It asks for endurance without promise. Neighbours compared situations, sometimes openly, sometimes carefully. Who still had a crop? Who had sold cattle? Who was behind at the bank? Who had relatives in California? Who had applied for relief? Who had packed already? Communities under strain develop a kind of watchfulness. People notice who buys flour on credit, who stops coming to church, whose children look thin, whose machinery sits unused, whose mailbox has official letters. There was sympathy, but there could also be judgment. Rural trade is complicated. People helped one another, but no one wanted to be the one needing help. A family might be starving slowly and still try to appear respectable in town. The bank represented more than money. It represented public knowledge. Once a foreclosure notice appeared, the family's trouble was no longer only private. The land records, the posted sale, the auction, the conversations in town, all of it made financial failure visible. And in a culture that valued independence, visible failure carried shame even when everyone knew the drought was real. This is one of the cruelest features of economic disaster. People can be ruined by forces far beyond their control and still feel personally guilty. A father might feel he had failed his family because the land failed. A mother might feel she had failed because the house could not be kept clean, or the meals could not be made filling enough. Children might feel the shame without knowing its source. There were renters and tenant farmers too, and their position could be even more fragile. Not every Dust Bowl family owned land. Some worked land owned by others. Some were sharecroppers or tenants, dependent on arrangements that could collapse quickly when crops failed. If a landowner could not collect rent or decided to change plans, a tenant family might be forced out with even less control over timing. They might not have land to sell, only labour that no longer had a place. For such families, the road west could come sooner, not because they were less attached to place, but because place had always been more precarious for them. And then there were the small towns that depended on the farmers. A storekeeper might carry accounts for families he had known for years. At first he extends credit because that is how community works. Then his own bills come due. A mechanic repairs a tractor and waits for payment after harvest, but harvest fails. A doctor treats a coughing child and knows the family cannot pay now, perhaps not later. A school district loses tax revenue. A church collection plate grows lighter. A bank faces too many bad loans. The countryside and the town were tied together by the same failed crop. When people say farmers lost everything, it is worth remembering that towns lost futures too. Still, life did not stop. Babies were born, people married. Church suppers happened when they could. Children played in dusty yards. Women exchanged recipes for making little seem like more. Men swapped parts, advice, rumours, and sometimes silence. A family might lose a cow one week and attend a neighbour's funeral the next. Hardship does not arrive with a pause button. It layers itself over ordinary life until ordinary life becomes almost unrecognisable, and yet must still be lived. Let me bring you to one particular evening near the edge of decision. The crop has failed badly enough that no one in the house is pretending anymore. The animals are fewer than they were. The banker sent a letter that sits on the table like a person no one invited. The father has been to town. He came back quieter than usual. The mother knows before he speaks that the news is not good. The children feel the room change. Supper is served because supper must be served. Maybe it is beans and bread. Maybe coffee for the adults, milk if there is any left for the younger ones. No one says the word foreclosure in front of the small children at first. Or maybe they do because secrecy takes energy, and there is not much energy left. After the meal, the father explains what has to happen. Not everything at once. Farm families often made decisions in steps because the full truth was too large. We may have to sell the team. We may have to let the Northfield go. We may have to ask your uncle for help. We may have to go west for work. We may have to leave for a while. That last phrase, for a while, carried mercy in it. It allowed the family to imagine return. Many people who left the plains did not at first think of themselves as leaving forever. They thought they were going to work, to survive, to get through the bad years. The idea of permanent loss was too heavy to lift all at once. Before the road, though, there was often one more sorting. What can be kept? What can be sold? What can be carried? What must be abandoned? The livestock had already forced such questions in living form. Now objects did. Tools were useful but heavy. Furniture had meaning but took space. Dishes could break. Books mattered but might not feed anyone. Photographs were light and therefore precious. Bedding was necessary. Cooking equipment was necessary. A sewing kit could become survival. A child's toy was not necessary by adult arithmetic, but sometimes parents made room anyway, because losing everything should not also mean making a child let go of the last small thing that still felt like home. The animals, if any remained, complicated departure. You could not pack a cow into a car already loaded with children and mattresses. You could not easily take a team of horses west if you had no feed and no certainty of work. Selling them might bring little, especially when many others were also selling. Keeping them might be impossible. Leaving them behind was unthinkable unless there was truly no other choice. So another round of loss came before departure, the reduction of a farm into what could move by road, and that is why this part of the Dust Bowl story is so important. The migration did not begin with wanderlust. It began with failed crops, unpaid debts, dead and sold animals, and the slow stripping away of the means to stay. By the time a family packed a car, much of the leaving had already happened. The field had left in the wind, the crop had left in failure, the livestock had left through sale, hunger, disease or death. The machinery had left through repossession or auction. Credit had left, confidence had left. The family was often the last thing still standing on the place. Outside the house, the yard is quieter now. Fewer animals make fewer sounds. The barn that once held work and noise may feel hollow. A stall stands empty. A harness hangs unused. Dust gathers in the corners. The field beyond the yard does not look like the foundation of a future. It looks like a question no one can answer. The father walks out at dusk and looks across it, as he has done 1,000 times. But now the looking has changed. He's not deciding what to plant. He's measuring what is gone. Inside, the mother begins thinking in bundles, sacks, boxes and blankets. She may not say this yet. She may still be cooking, cleaning, mending, tending children, and maintaining the appearance of a household that has not made its final decision. But part of her mind has already become a list. What food will travel? Which clothes can be layered? Where is the birth certificate, if there is one? Where are the family papers? Which quilt is warmest? Which pan can cook anything? How many jars can be taken without breaking? How do you pack a life so it does not spill open on the road? The children sense it. They may not understand the timing, but they understand that the house is being looked at differently. Adults open trunks. They sort drawers. They talk about relatives. They mention California or Arizona, or work in fruit, cotton, vegetables, anything that might pay. The younger children may feel excitement because the word California can sound like adventure if no one explains hunger carefully. Older children understand more. They look at the empty stall, the thin meals, the bank letter, the dust on the windowsill, and they know that whatever is coming is not a holiday. The farm is not gone yet. That is the painful thing. The house still stands. The road still passes it. The sky still opens above it. The family may still sleep there tonight and tomorrow night, and perhaps many nights after that. But ownership and belonging are already weakening. A place can become lost before the last door is closed. It becomes lost when staying no longer has a plan. It becomes lost when every object is judged by whether it can be sold or carried. It becomes lost when the animals are gone, and the field cannot pay, and the bank has more power over the future than the people who live there. So the next part of the story begins not with a dramatic goodbye, but with preparation. A car, if the family has one. A truck if they are fortunate. Mattresses tied on top. Tools wedged wherever they fit. Children assigned places among bundles. Food packed in tins or sacks. Water carried because the road is long. A mother looking once more through the kitchen to see what she's forgotten. A father checking tyres, engine, oil, and the load with the nervous care of a man who knows that if the car fails, the family may have nowhere to stand. Outside, the dust moves lightly across the yard again. Not a black blizzard this time, just enough to remind everyone that the land has already made its argument. Outside, the dust moves lightly across the yard again. Not a black blizzard this time, just enough to remind everyone that the land has already made its argument. The family has spent months, maybe years, trying not to answer it too quickly. They have waited for rain. They have planted when planting felt almost foolish. They have sold animals, stretched food, argued with numbers, listened to the bank, cleaned the house after storms, and told the children that things might improve. But now the talk in the kitchen has changed. It is no longer only about the next crop. It is about the car. That one word carries more weight than it should. The car is not new. It is not comfortable. It may already be unreliable, with tyres that have been patched more times than anyone wants to count, and an engine that makes sounds the father listens to with the seriousness of a doctor listening to lungs. It may be a Ford, a Chevrolet, a truck, or some worn-out vehicle that had once been a sign of progress, and now has to become a house on wheels. It was built to carry people, and perhaps a few goods, not an entire family's remaining life. But that is what thousands of families asked of vehicles like it. Many Dust Bowl migrants packed what they owned into cars and trucks and went west, especially toward California, where agricultural work seemed possible and the climate sounded more forgiving. Before anything is tied down, there is the sorting. That is the part photographs do not fully show. The famous images show the result: a car with mattresses tied on top, pots hanging from the side, children wedged among bundles, adults standing near the vehicle with faces that look older than their years. But before the photograph, if there had been one, there was a room full of choices. The mother opens drawers, trunks, cupboards, boxes. She knows the weight of everything because she has handled it for years. The quilt from her mother, the skillet that can cook almost anything, the plates that will break if packed badly, the family Bible, birth certificates if they have them, a wedding photograph, a tin of needles and thread, a few jars of food, work clothes, children's clothes, a coat that may seem unnecessary if California is imagined as warm, but mornings on the road can still bite, and poverty teaches people not to trust weather too much. The father thinks in a different list, though the lists overlap. Tools, spare parts, rope, a jack if they have one, oil, water. Anything that might keep the car moving when it should not be able to. He checks tyres with his hand. He looks under the hood. He listens to the engine. He may have to decide whether a heavy tool is worth more than a blanket, whether a box of bolts is worth more than a chair, whether keeping something useful today will cost them space they need for sleeping tomorrow. There is no right way to pack a ruined life. There are only choices that will seem insufficient later. The children may be excited at first, depending on their ages. Children can turn almost anything into a story before they understand the price of it. A long trip, a road, California, or maybe Arizona first, maybe relatives, maybe oranges, maybe work where the dust has not come through the walls. A younger child might ask if they are taking the dog. Another might ask when they are coming back. That question can stop a room. Adults may answer with something gentle and evasive. We will see when things get better. After we find work, after the rain. These answers are not lies exactly. They are ways of keeping a child from carrying the full weight of adult uncertainty. There are things that cannot be packed because they are too large. A bedstead, unless it can be dismantled and tied on, and even then maybe not. A table, chairs, a stove, a chest. Tools too heavy to justify. A spinning memory of ordinary domestic life that now becomes an inventory of abandonment. A house contains years of decisions, repairs, gifts, purchases, births, illnesses, holidays, routines, quarrels, reconciliations, and work. When a family prepares to leave under pressure, the house is forced to become a storage problem. That is one of the quiet violences of poverty. It makes sentimental things compete with survival things. A mother may stand with one object in her hands longer than necessary. Perhaps it is a dish that came from her own mother. Perhaps it is a child's first shoes. Perhaps it is a book. The object may be small enough to pack, but even small things add up. A car leaving the Dust Bowl could be loaded beyond safety, with bedding, boxes, kitchen goods, tools, water, food, and people, all occupying the same limited space. The vehicle had to climb roads, cross heat, survive dust, and keep moving across hundreds or more than 1,000 miles, depending on where the family started and where they hoped to land. The Oklahoma Historical Society notes that many families travelled west by Route 66, with the trip lasting 3 days or more for some, though that simple number hides breakdowns, lack of money, illness, and uncertainty. Try to imagine tying mattresses to the top of a car. It sounds almost practical until you picture the actual labour. The mattress is awkward. It catches wind. It has to be lifted, held, centred, roped down tightly enough that it will not shift on the road. Bedding is not a luxury in this situation. It is shelter. It is a bed in a ditch, a camp, a roadside stop, a migrant settlement, or the floor of a relative's porch if the family is fortunate. Blankets mean warmth. Quilts mean the difference between sleep and shivering. But every blanket carries dust from the house. Even the things they take with them are marked by the place they are leaving. The kitchen goods are chosen carefully. A skillet, because it can fry, heat, bake in a rough way, and survive hard use. A pot because beans, potatoes, soup and coffee need a vessel. Tin cups. A few plates, maybe enamelware if they have it because it can take rough handling. A knife. Spoons. A little flour if any remains. Beans if there are beans. Coffee if there is coffee. Salt. Lard if they have it. A woman who has cooked through scarcity knows that the road will not excuse hunger. Children will still wake hungry. Men will still need food. Work will not be found faster because the family forgot a pan. The kitchen shrinks, but it does not disappear. It becomes portable, packed in boxes and sacks and wedged beside someone's knees. Clothing is harder than it sounds. People leaving in desperation do not pack wardrobes. They pack layers, repairs, necessities, work shirts, overalls, dresses, underclothes, socks patched and repatched, shoes if there are extra shoes, baby clothes if there is a baby, something decent enough to wear into a town where strangers will judge them before they speak. That matters. Migrant families knew they would be seen. They knew a loaded car marked them. They knew dusty clothes and tired children told a story before they had a chance to explain it. Respectability was not a vanity. It was armour, thin but still worth wearing. The father may want to take more tools. A man who has lost land still has hands, and tools make hands employable. A hammer, pliers, wrenches, a saw, maybe a shovel. But tools are heavy, and a car too heavily loaded can break springs, strain tyres, overheat, and fail. The road west was not a clean path into opportunity. It could become a test of machinery as much as endurance. A breakdown might mean selling something important to pay for repairs. It might mean waiting along the road while other migrants pass. It might mean discovering that the family has left the farm but has not yet reached anything that could be called a new life. There is also the question of papers. It is easy to overlook, but documents matter when people become mobile. Land papers, debt papers, letters from relatives, identification, birth records, perhaps school records, perhaps addresses written carefully and folded into a Bible or envelope. Poor families often lived close to the edge of paperwork. They did not always have complete records, and what they had could be lost, damaged, or buried in a trunk. On the road, an address might be more valuable than a chair. A cousin near Bakersfield, a brother in Arizona, a rumour of cotton picking near Fresno. A camp where someone heard there was water. Information became another kind of luggage. The house grows emptier as the car grows heavier. That exchange is painful to watch. A room that was crowded with use begins to show gaps. A shelf cleared, a nail on the wall where something hung, a bed stripped, a drawer open and nearly empty. Children may notice the echo of footsteps. The mother may keep working because work protects her from stopping. She folds, wraps, ties, sorts, refuses some things, changes her mind about others, then refuses them again. The father comes in and out, measuring the load with his eyes, saying there is no room, saying maybe there is room if something is shifted, saying they cannot take that. Then seeing her face and taking it anyway if it is small enough. There may be an animal still present in this scene, a dog perhaps. Dogs appear in many family departures, sometimes taken, sometimes left with neighbours, sometimes abandoned when conditions become impossible. The decision could wound children deeply. A dog is not productive in the way a cow is productive or a mule is productive. But to a child, a dog may be the last friend not speaking in worried adult voices. Taking it means another mouth and another body in an already crowded vehicle. Leaving it means one more betrayal caused by circumstances no one chose. The Dust Bowl forced practical decisions onto emotional lives until the two could no longer be separated. Neighbours may come by, not always many. Sometimes people avoided departures because they did not want to face their own possible future. Sometimes they came because that is what neighbours do. A woman brings a little food, maybe more than she can spare. A man helps tie the load or check a tyre. Someone offers advice about the road. Someone says they heard there is work in California, though no one knows how much. Someone says a family from 2 counties over made it. Someone else says the border is hard now, or that wages are low, or that too many people are already there. Information arrives in pieces, some true, some rumour, all of it filtered through need. It is easy to imagine this moment as silent and tragic, but real departures are often cluttered with practical noise. Rope pulled tight, children told to move, a box repacked, someone asking where the matches are, a baby crying, the car door sticking, a neighbour calling out that the left rear tyre looks low, a woman realising the water bucket has not been filled, a man cursing softly at a knot, a child asking again about something that cannot be taken. The grief is there, but it is not always expressed in speeches. It is embedded in the logistics. And then there are the last looks. People look differently when they know a place may be behind them for good. The mother looks at the stove, the father looks at the barn. A child looks at a tree, a fence, a corner of the yard where games were played, or the doorway where height marks may have been scratched into wood. The house may not be beautiful. It may be poor, draughty, dusty, and difficult. But it has been the shape of life. Leaving it does not become easy just because staying has become impossible. Many families who left did so because they needed food, work, and healthier surroundings for their children. The Library of Congress describes families packing what they owned into cars and trucks and heading west after losing farms and ranches through foreclosure and hardship. That sentence sounds clear when written by an institution, but inside the family it was not clear. It was messy. It was full of last-minute arguments, shame, relief, fear, hope, and exhaustion. A person can be driven out and still feel guilty for leaving. A person can know a house is no longer safe and still love it. The car itself becomes a public declaration the moment it reaches the road. A loaded farm car in the 1930s was easy to recognise. Bedding on top, goods tied wherever they could be tied, children visible between bundles. Sometimes a washtub, chair, or spare tyre strapped on. Sometimes the whole vehicle sagging under the weight. The family may not yet think of itself as part of a mass migration, but to others on the road they are beginning to look like one. The photographs taken by Dorothea Lange and other Farm Security Administration photographers later fixed this image in American memory. Worn cars, tired families, belongings exposed, people moving because staying had failed. Lange and others documented migrants during the period when drought, depression and farm loss uprooted thousands of small farmers. Before departure, there may be one final walk through the house. Perhaps the mother does it. Perhaps the father does. Perhaps both separately. Empty rooms can be harder to look at than full ones. Full rooms distract you with tasks. Empty rooms show you what has ended. The floor still holds dust in the cracks. The windows still leak. The table may be gone or left behind. A nail, a stain, a broken latch, a child's mark, a patch in the wall, all of it suddenly visible as memory. People do not always cry in these moments. Sometimes they are too tired. Sometimes the body chooses numbness because there is a road ahead and children watching. But the absence records itself anyway. The father closes the door. That sounds simple too. It may be the door of a house still legally theirs, or one already lost, or one they are abandoning because the note cannot be paid. It may be locked, though there is little left worth stealing. It may be left unlocked because a neighbour may need to enter, or because the family no longer has the kind of control a lock implies. Closing a door behind you when you're not sure you will open it again is a physical act with a moral weight. It asks the hand to do what the mind may not be ready to accept. The children are arranged in the vehicle. This is not comfortable travel. Smaller children may sit on laps, on blankets, between boxes, on the floor if there is room. Older children may be expected to endure without complaint because everyone is uncomfortable. A baby may be held by the mother for hours. The air in the car may be hot, dusty and crowded. There may be no good place to stretch legs. Food has to be reachable but protected. Water has to be guarded. The family may carry a spare can of gasoline if they can. Money, if any remains, is kept carefully, because each purchase on the road reduces the margin between movement and being stranded. The road out of the farm may be one they have travelled many times, to church, to school, to town, to neighbours. It looks different now because it is no longer a route within home. It is the beginning of distance. The first mile may be the hardest or the easiest, depending on the person. Sometimes motion brings relief because decision has ended. They're going now. The argument is over. The packing is done. The house is behind them. Sometimes motion brings a new kind of panic because each turn of the wheels confirms what cannot be undone. They pass neighbours' places, some still occupied, some already abandoned, some holding on. A farm with laundry on the line, a barn half buried by drifted soil, a field that might produce nothing, a mailbox leaning, a child in another yard watching the loaded car pass and understanding more than adults wish. Every family on that road is a message to the family still staying. It says this can happen. It says we could not hold. It says maybe we are escaping. It says maybe you will be next. In town, the loaded car draws eyes. The general store, the bank, the filling station, the grain elevator, the church, the school, all the places that once formed the family's local world now become part of the leaving. Someone may wave. Someone may look away. Someone may make a remark about California. If the family stops for gas, every coin matters. The father may calculate distance against fuel. The mother may take children to a privy or side of a building. They may buy nothing extra because extra has become a dangerous word. A child may ask for candy and be refused in a tone that makes him understand not to ask again. The route west held its own power in American memory. Route 66 became the best-known road for many migrants from Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas, and nearby states, heading toward California, though migrants took many routes depending on where they began and where they hoped to find work. The Oklahoma Historical Society notes that the migration began in earnest in 1935 and peaked between 1937 and 1938, with many families travelling west toward California's agricultural valleys or Los Angeles. To later generations, Route 66 can sound romantic, a highway of motels and neon and freedom. For many Dust Bowl families, it was a road of worn tyres, overheated engines, hunger, police suspicion, and hope forced to ride beside fear. There is a particular sadness in the phrase, "nothing left to pack," because of course there was always more. There were always things left behind. A family did not pack little because they owned little in every case. They packed little because movement made ownership impossible. A chair may matter, but a chair cannot ride if a child needs that space. A heavy trunk may hold family history, but if the springs break, history will sit useless by the roadside. A plough may represent years of work, but westward migration does not need a plough if the family does not own land. Poverty on the road has its own logic. It values portability, durability, and immediate use. Everything else becomes memory. At night, the family may stop somewhere along the road, not at a pleasant campground arranged for travellers, but at the roadside, near other families, near a filling station if allowed, in a ditch, beside a field, wherever the car can rest without trouble. The first night away from the farm must have felt strange. The sky overhead may be clearer than home or just as dusty. The children are tired. Bedding is untied or partially pulled down. Food is prepared with difficulty. Coffee boiled, beans heated, bread cut. The mother tries to create a meal from a packed kitchen, while the father checks the car again. Around them, other families may be doing the same. Quiet voices, children crying, someone coughing, a tyre being worked on, a baby fed. A dog nosing around scraps if there is a dog. The beginning of a migrant community formed not by choice, but by shared displacement. That first roadside meal is important. It proves the family can still function away from the house. It also proves how much harder everything will be. There is no proper table, water is limited, dust may still be present, privacy is gone, cooking is awkward, children are restless. The mother has to remember where she packed everything because the organisation of the old kitchen no longer exists. The father may be thinking about miles, repairs and money. The family eats under open air or inside the cramped car, and for a moment the scale of what has happened becomes clear. Yesterday, even in hardship, they had a place. Tonight they have a vehicle and whatever space the road allows. The children may fall asleep first because children can sleep in conditions adults cannot. Their heads rest against bundles, laps, windows, each other. The mother watches them and may feel both sorrow and fierce relief. They are with her. That matters. Whatever was left behind, the children are here. The father may sit awake longer. Men in these stories are sometimes described as defeated, and many were, but defeat is not the same as emptiness. He's planning even while afraid. How far tomorrow? Where to buy gas? Whether the tyres will hold? Whether the rumours about work are true? Whether California will let them in? Whether he has failed, or whether failure is the wrong word for what happened? These questions do not let a person sleep easily. Behind them, the farm remains. It may sit under stars or dust or a rising wind. The house is quieter than it has been in years. No children shifting in bed, no mother moving through the kitchen, no father stepping outside before dawn. The barn holds fewer animals or none. The field waits without expectation. It is tempting to say the family left the farm, but a part of the truth is that the farm had already left them. Its soil had moved, its crop had failed, its animals had been sold or died, Its credit had collapsed. What remained was a location, a structure, and a memory of the life that had once connected them. Ahead of them, the road does not yet know their names. They are not yet workers in a California field. They are not yet called Okies by strangers. They are not yet living in a camp searching for wages or discovering that thousands of other families have heard the same rumours and followed the same hope. For this moment, they are between identities, not fully farmers now, not yet settled anywhere else. They are a family in an overloaded car carrying blankets, tools, children, documents, cookware, and the last usable pieces of home. And as morning comes, the father starts the engine again. Everyone listens, because the sound of that engine is now tied to survival. If it catches, the day can begin. If it does not, the whole plan becomes suddenly fragile. The engine turns, complains, then runs. Bedding is secured. Children are shifted into place. The mother checks that water and food are reachable. The father looks down the road. There is no grand speech because people who are truly leaving often have too much to do for speeches. The car pulls forward, slow under its load, and the family joins the long westward movement of people who had once believed that land meant permanence. Ahead are towns that may not want them, fields that may underpay them, camps that may shame them, and a new word that will follow many of them whether they came from Oklahoma or not. Ahead are towns that may not want them, fields that may underpay them, camps that may shame them, and a new word that will follow many of them whether they came from Oklahoma or not. Okie, yeah. At first glance, it sounds almost harmless, the kind of nickname someone might toss around with a grin, short, plain, easy to say. But in the 1930s, on the road west, and especially in California, that word could land like a slap. It did not simply mean a person from Oklahoma. It came to mean poor, desperate, dirty, unwanted, ignorant, backward, diseased, a burden, a problem arriving in a car with too many children and not enough money. It became a label that took families who had once been farmers, neighbours, church members, landowners, tenants, skilled workers, mothers, fathers, and children, and reduced them to one tired, suspicious word. But before the shame, there was the road, and the road itself deserves to be taken seriously because getting west was not a clean line on a map. It was a physical ordeal. The family in the overloaded car is left behind the farm, but they have not yet arrived anywhere that can support them. They are suspended between loss and possibility, moving through heat, dust, mechanical trouble, hunger and rumour. Every mile matters because every mile costs gasoline. Every sound from the engine matters because every repair costs money. Every town matters because the family needs water, food, perhaps a place to stop, and perhaps directions. Every stranger matters because a stranger may offer work, help, warning, or contempt. The car is crowded from the beginning. The younger children doze against bundles. Older children sit stiffly, trying not to complain because they know complaining will change nothing. The mother holds a baby if there is one, or a bag of food, or both. Her lap is not really her own anymore. It is storage, comfort, and control. The father drives with both hands on the wheel, listening to the engine the way he once listened to the wind over his fields. A farmer knows machines because he has to, but a machine on the road is different from a machine on the farm. If a tractor fails in the yard, you're still at home. If a car fails in the desert or along a roadside hundreds of miles from help, the whole family becomes vulnerable in a new way. The road west was lined with people in similar trouble. Not always bumper to bumper, not always in the dramatic way movies show it, but enough that migrants recognised each other by sight. The loaded car, the bedding tied on top, the wash tub or chair or spare tyre lashed where it could fit, the children's faces looking out from between possessions, the father's tired eyes, the mother's guarded expression. These families did not need formal introductions. Their vehicles told much of the story before anyone spoke. Where are you from? Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas, Kansas, Missouri, Colorado. How long have you been on the road? Where are you headed? Do you have people there? Did you hear about work near Bakersfield? Did you hear the picking is good near Fresno? Did you hear they are turning people back? Did you hear wages are down to almost nothing? Rumour was a kind of weather on that road. It moved fast, changed shape, and affected decisions. A family might hear that cotton work was available in one valley, fruit picking in another, road work somewhere else. They might hear that a camp had water, that a sheriff was moving migrants along, that a border crossing was hard, that a grower was hiring, that a town had signs warning outsiders away. Some rumours were true, some were half true, some were already outdated by the time they reached the next roadside stop, but people had to act on something. When you have lost land, crop, livestock and savings, even uncertain information can feel valuable. Route 66 became the most famous road in this movement, though it was not the only one. For many families coming from Oklahoma and nearby states, it was the path that seemed to point toward California like a promise laid in concrete and dust. Later it would be called the Mother Road, and later still it would become part of American nostalgia. Motels, diners, neon signs, vacations, open road freedom. But to a Dust Bowl family in the 1930s, that road was not romance. It was necessity. It was a corridor of endurance. It carried people who were not travelling because they wanted scenery, but because staying had become impossible. The first days of travel could strip away the last illusion that leaving solved anything quickly. The farm had been hard, but at least it had known places to sleep, cook, wash and stand. The road offered none of those automatically. At night the family had to stop wherever they could, sometimes beside other migrants, sometimes near a river or ditch if water was available, sometimes outside a town where they were watched with suspicion. Bedding came down from the car or was partly unrolled. A small fire might be made if allowed, and if fuel could be found. Food was cooked from what had been packed. Beans, bread, coffee, potatoes, whatever remained. The mother tried to feed everyone under conditions that made even simple tasks difficult. Cooking from the back of a packed car with tired children and limited water is not a quaint camp scene. It is domestic labour forced into public view. Privacy disappeared almost immediately. A family that once had its own kitchen, however poor, now cooked where others could see. A mother washed children's faces with too little water. Clothes were shaken out by the roadside. Babies were changed without proper space. Arguments that would once have happened behind a door now risked being overheard. Fatigue made everyone more fragile, but there was nowhere to be fragile privately. Poverty on the road exposes the body. It makes eating, sleeping, washing, nursing, coughing, crying, and disciplining children visible to strangers. That exposure was part of the shame. The children learned the road through discomfort, heat inside the car, dust in the throat, long hours sitting still, adults telling them to hold on, be quiet, wait, not now. They learned the importance of water by watching how carefully it was used. They learned money by noticing when their father counted coins before buying gasoline. They learned social rank by seeing how storekeepers looked at them, how local children stared, how some people called them names. A child who had once belonged to a farm community, even a struggling one, now belonged to a moving category of people others feared might stop and stay. And the fear was real on the receiving end, though not always fair. California in the 1930s was not an empty garden waiting kindly for farm families from the plains. It had its own unemployed workers, its own depression hardship, its own labour tensions, its own growers who wanted cheap seasonal labour, but did not necessarily want permanent poor families settling nearby. Agricultural California needed hands at harvest time. Cotton, grapes, peaches, oranges, lettuce, peas and other crops required workers in large numbers, often for short periods. But needing labour did not mean respecting labourers. In fact, the oversupply of desperate workers often allowed wages to be pushed lower. Families arrived hoping for work and discovered that thousands of others had arrived hoping for the same thing. This is where the word Okie hardened into something cruel. It was used broadly, often against migrants from Oklahoma, Arkansas, Texas, Missouri, and other states. Not with careful concern for geography, but as a class insult. It marked people as poor outsiders. It suggested they were responsible for their condition, that they brought dirt and dependency with them, that they would crowd schools, burden relief agencies, lower wages, spread disease, and disturb the order of communities that were already under strain. Once a label like that attaches itself to people, it can become a shortcut for not seeing them clearly. Imagine arriving at a town after days on the road, hoping to buy supplies or ask about work, and seeing faces close against you before you have done anything wrong. A shopkeeper may serve you quickly, but coldly. A deputy may tell you not to camp nearby. A local man may joke about Okies within earshot. A sign may make it clear that migrants are not welcome. The family has already lost land, animals, income and home. Now they begin losing public dignity. They are no longer simply unfortunate. They are being treated as if misfortune has made them suspect. The father feels this sharply. He was once a farmer, and whatever the bank now says, that identity carried weight. He knew soil, animals, weather, equipment, neighbours, church, debts, and obligations. He may have been poor, but he was not rootless. On the road and in California fields, he becomes another man looking for work. Sometimes he must stand in a line with dozens or hundreds of others, while a grower or labour contractor chooses who will be hired. The work may be temporary, the pay low, the conditions poor. He may accept wages that would once have felt insulting because children need food. He may be turned away by men who do not know his history and do not care to learn it. That kind of treatment changes a person's posture. A man used to walking his own fields may lower his eyes when asking for work, or he may become harder, angrier, more silent. Shame does not always make people meek. Sometimes it makes them defensive because defence is all they have left. If someone calls him an Okie with contempt, he may swallow it because fighting could cost the family a chance at work. Or he may answer back and risk trouble. Either way, the word does its damage. It tells him that other people have decided what he is before he speaks. The mother feels it differently, but no less deeply. She knows how her family appears. She knows the children's clothes are worn. She knows the car is loaded. She knows their faces are tired. She knows the baby may cry in public, that the older children may look hungry, that washing properly is difficult, that dust from the road clings to everything. She may work fiercely to keep them neat because neatness is one of the last defences against judgment. Hair combed, faces wiped, clothes patched, shoes tied, a clean collar if possible. These details matter more when strangers are looking for reasons to despise you. In migrant camps, whether official or informal, the struggle to maintain dignity became a daily project. Some families lived in tents, shacks, cars, or makeshift shelters built from scrap wood, canvas, cardboard, and tin. Sanitation could be poor. Water might be limited. Disease spread more easily where people were crowded and undernourished. Children played in dust and mud near drainage ditches or irrigation canals. Women tried to cook, wash, mend, and protect family routines in conditions that made every task public and difficult. A camp was not just a place to sleep. It was a place where private family life had been forced into emergency architecture. There were government camps built under New Deal programs that offered cleaner conditions, running water, toilets, showers, and a measure of self-government. These camps became important symbols because they showed that migrants could live decently when given basic infrastructure and respect. But there were never enough of them for everyone. Many families still lived in squalid roadside settlements or private labour camps where conditions were far worse. The difference between a well-run government camp and a ditchbank settlement could be the difference between feeling like a citizen in hardship and feeling like refuse at the edge of someone else's prosperity. Now let us stand with the family as they arrive near an agricultural district after days or weeks of travel. They have heard there may be work. They are not alone. Cars and trucks line roads and camp areas. Families have come from many places, all carrying versions of the same hope. The father asks where hiring happens. Someone points. Another warns that wages are low because too many workers have come. He goes anyway because low wages are still wages if nothing else exists. The mother waits with the children, perhaps near the car, perhaps near a camp, watching the movement of other families and trying to understand the rules of this new life quickly. Work in California agriculture was often seasonal and unstable. A family might pick one crop for a short time, then move on to another. Cotton here, peas there, fruit elsewhere. The work was hard, bent-backed, hot, and paid by amount picked, or by the day, depending on the crop and arrangement. Children often work too, because a family's survival could depend on every available pair of hands. The dream of California as rescue became complicated the moment work began. The land was fertile, yes. There were crops, yes. But fertility belonged to growers. Migrants had access to wages, not security. A family that once produced food on its own land now might pick food it could barely afford to buy. There is a bitterness in that reversal. Imagine standing in a field of fruit, your hands moving quickly because pay depends on speed, while your own children are hungry at the edge of the day. Imagine harvesting abundance for someone else after leaving a farm where your own abundance failed. California looked green compared to the Dust Bowl, and that greenness could hurt. It proved that the world still had plenty somewhere, just not necessarily for you. The word Okie followed workers into fields and camps. Local newspapers, officials, growers, and residents sometimes describe migrants as a social problem. Some worried about crime, disease, sanitation, school costs and relief burdens. Some of those worries came from real pressures on local systems. Many came from prejudice. Migrants were blamed for being poor in places where their poverty was inconvenient. They were needed when crops had to be picked and resented when the picking was done. That contradiction sat at the centre of the migrant experience. Their labour was wanted, their presence was not. Children carried the label into schools when they attended. A migrant child might arrive late in the term, leave early when the family moved for work, wear worn clothes, speak with an accent other children recognised as rural or southern, and be immediately marked. Okie children could be teased, isolated, or treated as temporary. Teachers varied, of course. Some were kind and saw intelligence behind hardship. Others shared the prejudices of their communities. For a child, the shame of migration could be learned in a classroom as sharply as in a field. A word shouted by another child can become a lifelong memory. And yet, these families were not passive. This is important. The story of becoming an Okie is not only a story of humiliation, it is also a story of adaptation, stubbornness, labour organising, mutual aid, music, religion, cooking, humour, and the fierce maintenance of family identity under pressure. People shared food when they could. Women watched each other's children. Men helped repair cars. Families exchanged news about work. Migrants formed communities, even when those communities were temporary. Churches, camp meetings, songs, and storytelling helped people remember that they were more than what outsiders called them. Music travelled with them too. So did language, recipes, habits, and ways of worship. The migrants brought the culture of the southern plains into California, and over time that culture changed California in ways many Californians did not initially welcome but could not prevent. The people mocked as Okies did not simply disappear into shame. They worked, settled, moved again, organised, raised children, bought homes when they could, and became part of the state's labour and cultural history. But in the moment we are standing in now, those later outcomes are not yet visible. What is visible is the next day's work, the next meal, the next insult, the next place to sleep. Let us return to the family in the evening after a day of searching or working. They come back to wherever they are camped. If the father found work, the relief may be immediate but small. If he did not, the silence around supper will feel familiar in a new place. The mother cooks from what they have. The children are dirty, not from the farm now, but from the road, the camp, the field. Dust is still part of life, though different dust. The car stands nearby. No longer just transportation, but storage, shelter, and symbol. It tells everyone that the family is not settled. It tells the family that they have not yet arrived, no matter how many miles they have travelled. A nearby family may be from Arkansas, another from Texas, another truly from Oklahoma. The word Okie covers them all when spoken by outsiders, but among themselves they may keep distinctions. County names, town names, rivers, churches, crops, who had wheat, who had cotton, who had cattle, who had rented, who had owned. These details matter because they are the maps of lost identity. A person who has been flattened by a slur may resist by remembering specifics. I am from Cimarron County. I am from near Pampa. I am from outside Salisor. I am not just what you call me. There is an emotional danger in being forced to move among people who think your need makes you inferior. Shame can enter the family if there is nowhere else for it to go. Parents may become short with children. Children may become embarrassed by parents. Men may feel useless when they cannot find steady work. Women may feel judged for camp conditions they cannot improve. Teenagers may dream of shedding the Okie label as quickly as possible, changing speech, clothing, friends, anything that marks them as migrant. Survival sometimes requires adaptation, but adaptation can feel like betrayal when it means hiding where you came from. At the same time, pride could harden. Many migrants came from communities that valued toughness, work, religious faith, and family loyalty. Being insulted did not mean accepting the insult as true. A man might say, "Let them call us what they want." A woman might say, "My children will be clean even if we live in a tent." A child might learn to fight. Another might learn to outwork everyone. Families use pride as a brace against humiliation. Sometimes pride helped them endure. Sometimes it made suffering harder to admit. But without some form of pride, the road could take more than possessions. It could take the self. The growers and labour contractors understood desperation. That is one of the darkest parts of the story. When too many workers are available, each worker's bargaining power collapses. A family may accept low pay because refusing means another family gets the job. If workers try to organise for better wages, they may face intimidation, eviction from camps, arrest, or violence. California agriculture had long histories of migrant labour and labour conflict before the Dust Bowl migrants arrived, involving Mexican, Filipino, Japanese, Chinese and other workers. The arrival of white migrants from the plains did not create exploitation, but it entered and reshaped an existing system of seasonal agricultural labour. The newcomers discovered that whiteness did not protect them from poverty's contempt, though it affected how they were treated in ways different from non-white workers. History is rarely clean in these matters. The family may not understand all of this system. They understand that the pay is low. They understand that the field boss has power. They understand that asking too many questions may cost them. They understand that work may last only a few days. They understand that the next harvest is somewhere else. The road west, then, doesn't end at California. It continues within California, from crop to crop, camp to camp, rumour to rumour. Migration becomes a pattern rather than a single journey. There were moments of kindness too, and they deserve a place here. A local family might give food. A teacher might help a migrant child. A doctor might treat someone without expecting full payment. A government camp manager might insist on fair treatment. Other migrants might share a tent space, a repair, a lead on work. Hard times do not erase decency, but kindness did not cancel the larger hostility. A family could receive a meal from one stranger and be called Okie trash by another on the same day. That emotional whiplash was part of the experience. Imagine the mother washing clothes at a camp facility if one exists, or in a bucket if not. Around her are other women doing the same. They talk while working because work is where conversation can happen. They discuss wages, children's coughs, men looking for jobs, rumours of better camps, bad treatment in a town, a baby born last week, a family that left for the north, a letter from home. The washing itself is hard, but the conversation matters. It creates a small community among women whose lives have been made unstable. They may not say they are lonely. They may not have time for such a word. But they know the relief of being understood without explaining everything. The father may sit with other men near the cars after dark. Men who once had land or work now compare engines, wages, roads, and employers. Some talk angrily, some talk hopefully. Some say they will go back when the rain returns. Some know they will not. The older men may feel the loss of status sharply. Younger men may adapt faster, though not without bitterness. Someone may have a guitar or harmonica. Someone may sing. Music does not solve hunger, but it can organise sorrow into something people can bear for a few minutes. For the children, camp life can be both hardship and strange adventure. They find other children quickly. They play among cars, tents, ditches and fields. They invent games with whatever is available. They learn which adults are kind and which to avoid. They hear insults before they fully understand them. They become translators between old family life and the new world faster than their parents expect. Some will later remember the hunger and shame. Some will remember freedom on the road. Most will remember both. Childhood does not obey a single mood, even in disaster. The shame of becoming an Okie was not only imposed by Californians. It was also created by the collapse of an American promise. These families had been told in countless ways that land, labour, thrift and endurance could produce independence. When that promise failed, the label Okie stepped into the gap and made the failure sound personal. Instead of seeing a national environmental and economic disaster, outsiders could see a type of person. That is always a dangerous move in history. It is easier to blame poor people for appearing than to ask what uprooted them. And what had uprooted them was vast. Drought, overploughing, falling crop prices, debt, foreclosure, dust pneumonia, livestock loss, mechanisation, the Depression, local and national policy failures. Hope extended too long because hope was necessary. None of that fit inside the word Okie. A slur is small because it is designed to be small. It removes context. It removes causes. It removes the long road before arrival. It sees the loaded car and not the kitchen table where the decision to leave was made. One evening, perhaps after weeks in California, perhaps after only days, the family sits beside their car while the sun goes down over a landscape greener than the one they left. The father has found a few days of work, or he has not. The mother has managed supper. The children are tired. Someone nearby is coughing. Someone else is laughing, because even in camps people laugh. The car is dusty again. Not Dust Bowl dust exactly, but road dust, field dust, camp dust. The word Okie has already been heard, maybe shouted from a passing car, maybe muttered at a store, maybe printed in a newspaper. The family has learned that arrival does not mean welcome, but they are still here. That matters too. They are tired, diminished, insulted, uncertain, but not erased. The road has taken much from them, but it has also carried them forward. They have crossed from one form of hardship into another, and this second hardship has its own rules. Work when it appears. Move when the crop ends. Keep the children fed. Keep the car running. Keep papers dry. Keep dignity if possible. Keep memory of the place left behind without letting it break you. Keep going because stopping without shelter is not an option. As darkness settles, the mother may fold a blanket around a child. The father may check the tyres again, not because they are leaving tonight, but because checking has become habit. Nearby, other families settle in, each carrying its own farm, town, debts, dead animals, lost fields, and closed doors inside memory. From a distance, a local person might see only a camp of Okies, too many people, too many cars, too much need. But inside that camp are individual histories as detailed as any town record, as real as any property deed, as worthy as any family Bible. The shame of becoming an Okie was powerful, but it was not the final truth of these people. It was a name placed on them during the hardest passage of their lives. The deeper truth is that they were Americans forced to learn how quickly belonging can be taken away, when land fails, money fails, and strangers decide that need itself is a moral defect. They had once measured life by acres, rainfall, livestock, harvest, and the distance to town. Now they measured it by miles, wages, camps, rumours, and whether the children had eaten enough to sleep. And still, somewhere behind them, the plains remained under that wide, damaged sky. Some families would one day return. Many would not. Some would build new lives in California and carry the old place inside them like a wound that slowly became a story. Some children raised under the Okie label would grow up determined never to be looked down on again. The word would linger, soften in some mouths, remain bitter in others, and eventually become part of American memory through songs, novels, photographs, and family histories. But for the family sitting beside the road tonight, none of that future has arrived. They are still in the middle of it, still trying to turn motion into survival, still learning that losing everything can continue even after the farm is gone. They are still in the middle of it, still trying to turn motion into survival, still learning that losing everything can continue even after the farm is gone. That may be the most difficult truth of the Dust Bowl. Leaving did not end the loss. Rain did not end it. A government program did not end it. A job in a California field did not end it. Even the return of grass and better farming methods, important as they were, did not hand back what had already been taken from the families who lived through those years. Some disasters destroy what is visible, and then the visible world is repaired. A bridge is rebuilt. A roof is replaced. A road is cleared. But the Dust Bowl took things that were harder to measure and nearly impossible to return. It took health. It took years of childhood. It took confidence in the land. It took the old belief that hard work alone could keep a family secure. It took neighbours from one another. It took people's names for themselves and replaced them with names strangers used against them. It took the future many families thought they had earned before they ever got to live inside it. By the late 1930s, the worst years began to ease in some places. Rain returned more regularly in parts of the plains. Not everywhere at once, not as if some curtain lifted and the whole region was saved in a single morning, but enough that the land could begin to recover where people changed how they treated it. The federal government, which had been forced to see soil as a national concern rather than a private inconvenience, invested in conservation. The Soil Conservation Service taught and supported methods meant to hold the ground in place. Farmers were encouraged to contour plough, plant cover crops, leave strips of grass, rotate crops, and stop treating every bare acre as an acre waiting to be broken. Trees were planted in shelter belts to slow the wind. Demonstration farms showed that the old way could not continue without consequences. The country learned painfully that soil was not endless, and this matters. We should not pretend nothing was done. The lessons of the Dust Bowl changed American agriculture. They changed how officials thought about erosion, drought, land use, and the federal government's responsibility when private decisions and environmental damage became a public crisis. The catastrophe helped create a conservation movement with practical force behind it. Farmers who had once viewed erosion as bad luck or a local problem began to hear it described as something that could be managed, prevented, and reduced. Not perfectly, never perfectly, but seriously, that shift was not small. It meant that the suffering of those families entered policy, entered science, entered training, entered the way future generations would be warned. But now I want you to sit with the other side of that sentence. The country learned. The land began to recover. Some families eventually rebuilt. But the people who paid the tuition for that lesson were not reimbursed. The dead children did not come back. The lungs damaged by dust were not made new. The farms lost at auction did not automatically return to the families who had worked them. The animals sold for almost nothing were gone. The years spent moving from crop to crop, sleeping in cars, living in camps, enduring insults, could not be exchanged for better years later. A policy can repair a system. It cannot restore a childhood. Think of a child who left the plains at 8 years old enough to remember the farm, young enough not to understand why adults could not save it. That child remembers dust on the windowsill and the taste of grit in food. He remembers his mother wiping his face with a damp cloth during a storm. He remembers the cow being sold, or the dog left behind, or his father staring at the car engine on the side of the road. He remembers arriving in California and hearing the word "Okie" before he understood why it hurt. Years later, he may have a job, a house, children of his own. He may even laugh about hard times because people often learn to make pain manageable through humour. But somewhere inside him, the lesson remains. Home can vanish. Adults can be helpless. Work does not always save you. A name can be taken from you by people who know nothing about your life. That is not a debt anyone pays back. The Dust Bowl also took the old map of community. On the plains, distance had always mattered. Farms were spread apart. Neighbours might not live close by modern standards, but they were still woven into one another's lives through harvest, church, school, trading, births, illness, weather, and emergencies. People knew who had a good team of horses, whose well was reliable, who could repair a pump, who had lost a child, who made the best bread, who sang loudly in church, who was behind at the store but too proud to say so. A community is made of these details. It is not only a place, it is a web of knowledge accumulated over years. When families left, that web tore. Sometimes one family left, then another, then 3 more, then the school had fewer children, the church had fewer voices, the store had fewer customers, and the road past a vacant farmhouse began to feel like an accusation. The people who stayed lost neighbours. The people who left lost witnesses to their former lives. That is a particular kind of loneliness. When you move to a place where no one knows who you were before disaster, you have to carry your own past without help. In California, a man who had once been respected in his county might be seen only as another desperate migrant. A woman who had managed a farm household with skill and endurance might be seen only as a poor camp mother. Children who had belonged somewhere became newcomers everywhere. The loss was not only economic, it was social memory, and the land itself held scars. Soil can recover, but not instantly. Topsoil lost to wind is not replaced in a season. Fences buried by dust, fields stripped thin, houses abandoned, towns weakened, all of this marked the region. Even where rain returned, the memory of dryness stayed. Farmers who survived did not look at the sky the same way afterward. A dry spell was no longer merely inconvenient. It could carry the echo of the 1930s. A windstorm could make older people pause. Dust on a windowsill could summon more than annoyance. The Dust Bowl trained a generation to distrust abundance a little, because they had seen what happened when abundance was mistaken for permanence. There is something we need to be honest about here. The Dust Bowl was not only something that happened to people, it was also something people helped create, though not with equal knowledge, power, or responsibility. The drought was natural, the heat and wind were natural, but the exposure of the soil was human, the overploughing was human, the economic pressure to plant more wheat was human. The land speculation, the boosterism, the debt, the belief that every acre must produce, all of that was human. And yet the families who suffered were often the same families who had been encouraged, rewarded, and pressured into those choices. That is what makes blame such a blunt tool here. A farmer breaking more land in 1925 may have thought he was being responsible. A banker financing expansion may have thought he was helping progress. A government that encouraged settlement may have believed it was building the nation. A railroad advertisement promising opportunity may have sounded like hope rather than danger. The disaster came when all those reasonable pieces met a climate that did not negotiate. So what did the Dust Bowl take that could never be repaid? It took innocence about the American landscape. Before the storms, many Americans believed the continent was too large to damage seriously, too rich to exhaust, too generous to resist human ambition for long. The Dust Bowl proved that the land had limits. It proved that grass had been doing work people had not valued because it had not sent them a bill. It proved that soil was a form of wealth more basic than money, and that when it was gone, banks, machinery, markets, and optimism could not replace it. This was not an abstract environmental lesson. It was written in coughs, foreclosures, dead cattle, empty houses, and cars moving west under impossible loads. It also took away the clean separation between private life and public policy. A family sitting at supper with dust in the beans was living inside decisions made far beyond that table. Wheat prices set by national and international markets, credit systems, land policy, agricultural advice, relief policy, county decisions, state border enforcement, labour practices in California. The idea that a farm family's fate belonged only to that family became harder to maintain. The Dust Bowl showed how completely ordinary people could be trapped inside systems they did not control. That lesson remains uncomfortable because it interrupts one of the stories Americans like best, the story that the individual family, if strong enough, can stand apart from history. The families of the Dust Bowl could not stand apart from history. History came through the walls, and yet we should not turn them into only victims. That would be its own kind of disrespect. They adapted. They endured. They made jokes in camps. They sang songs. They organised. They cleaned children's faces with too little water because dignity still mattered. They wrote letters home. They saved recipes and tools and family stories. They learned new crops, new roads, new kinds of work. Some returned to the plains. Some stayed in California. Some moved again and again until a place finally held them. Some children of migrants became workers, soldiers, teachers, business owners, musicians, parents, determined to give their own children a steadier life. People can be wounded and still be capable. The Dust Bowl took much, but it did not take everything from everyone in the same way. Human beings are rarely that simple. Still, survival should not be mistaken for repayment. This is important. A family may survive a disaster and still carry losses that never close. If a mother kept her children alive in a migrant camp, that is strength. But it does not mean the camp was fair. If a father found work after losing his farm, that is endurance. But it does not mean the farm was not lost. If a child grew up tough, that toughness may be admirable, but it may also have been purchased with fear no child should have had to know. We sometimes praise resilience because we do not want to look too closely at what required it. The Dust Bowl created resilience, yes. It also created grief. Let us return one last time to the family we have followed, not as famous people, not as symbols carved into a monument, but as ordinary Americans whose names may not appear in any textbook. They have left the plains. They have carried what they could. They have been called Okies, whether or not Oklahoma was truly their home. They have worked when work was available. They have slept in places they would not have chosen. They have eaten meals cooked beside a car, washed children in public, and learned to watch the faces of strangers before asking for anything. Now imagine them years later, after the worst has passed. Maybe they are still in California. Maybe the father has steady work at last, or something close to it. Maybe the mother has a proper kitchen again. Maybe the children are older, their accents changed, their memories uneven. Maybe there is a small house, not the old farm, but a house. A window that closes, a bed that stays in one place. A table that does not have to be packed in a hurry. One evening perhaps, wind rises outside. Not a Dust Bowl storm, just wind. The kind most people ignore, but one of them hears it differently. The mother pauses while washing dishes. The father looks toward the window. A grown child remembers a lamp burning at noon. No one needs to say much. In families that survive disasters, memory often moves through the room without introduction. A sound, a smell, the colour of the sky, the grit of sand on a windowsill, and suddenly the past is not past. It is present for a moment, standing near the table. That is another thing the Dust Bowl took. It took the ability to hear wind innocently. The photographs remain, and they have shaped how later generations see these people. Dorothea Lange's images, Arthur Rothstein's images, the government photographers who documented migrant camps, abandoned farms, worn faces and loaded cars gave the nation a record it could not easily deny. But photographs have a danger too. They freeze people at the moment of suffering. A woman becomes the migrant mother, a man becomes the defeated farmer, a child becomes the Dust Bowl child. The image is true, but not complete. Before the photograph, there were years of ordinary life. After it, there were years of continued living. History owes people the dignity of that fullness. The Dust Bowl also took away many Americans' trust in easy progress. The tractor, the plough, the wheat boom, the expansion of acreage, the confidence of settlement, all had looked like progress, and in some ways they were. Machinery made labour faster, wheat fed people, roads connected communities, markets created opportunity. But progress without restraint had turned dangerous. These AIM tools that helped families build lives also helped expose the land at a scale earlier generations could not have managed. That is a hard lesson because it does not ask us to reject progress. It asks us to respect consequences. It asks us to ask what the tool is doing not only today, but 10 years from now, in drought, under pressure, across millions of acres, when everyone uses it at once. By the end of the 1930s, as rain returned and conservation expanded, some Plains families slowly rebuilt a version of life. Fields were managed differently. Grass returned in some places. Shelter belts grew. The worst dust storms became less frequent. But an improved field is not the same as an unbroken past. The region carried an absence, empty farms, families gone west, graves of children who had not survived illness, debts that had shaped marriages, young people who never came back, old people who stayed and remembered when the land looked different. A landscape can recover and still be haunted by what recovery required. So when we ask why thousands of Americans lost everything during the Dust Bowl, the answer is not one sentence. They lost everything because drought struck land that had been made vulnerable. They lost everything because wheat prices fell and debt stayed due. They lost everything because the grass that held the soil had been ploughed under. They lost everything because banks, markets, weather and policy met inside the lives of ordinary people. They lost everything because a family can do everything it knows how to do and still be overmatched by history. But they also lost everything because everything was larger than land and money. Everything included belonging, health, reputation, confidence, childhood, the right to be known by your own name in a place that understood you. And this is where I want to bring us gently back to the room you are in now. The floor under you is probably steady. The air is probably clear enough that you're not thinking about it. If there is a glass of water near you, it is not covered against dust. If there is food in your kitchen, you may not know the field it came from, the soil that held it, the rain that helped it, or the labour that carried it to you. That is modern life. It gives us distance from the land, and sometimes distance becomes forgetfulness. The Dust Bowl asks us not to forget. Not in a scolding way, in a practical way. It asks us to remember that soil is not just background. Rain is not just weather. A farm is not just scenery passed from a highway. A family's security can depend on things that look quiet until they fail. The people of the Dust Bowl learned that lesson in the harshest way possible. They learned it while stuffing cloth into window cracks. They learned it while watching fields rise into the sky. They learned it while selling animals they had hoped to keep. They learned it while packing cars and driving west under the eyes of strangers. They learned it while accepting wages that barely held hunger back. They learned it while trying to teach children not to be ashamed of where they came from. And because they learned it, the country eventually learned too, though not soon enough to spare them. Somewhere in the old Dust Bowl country, the wind still moves across the plains, It moves through grasses, over fields, past old fence lines, around towns that survived and places that did not. On a clear day, the sky can be enormous and beautiful in the way only plain sky can be. The land can look peaceful. Wheat still grows in many places. Cattle still graze. Families still work. Children still ride buses to school along roads that once saw overloaded cars heading west. Life continued, because life almost always does. But under that continuation lies memory, and maybe that is what could never be repaid most of all. The sense of safety people once had before they knew the ground could leave them. Once that knowledge enters a family, it does not fully leave. It becomes a story told at tables. It becomes a habit of saving. It becomes a reluctance to waste. It becomes a fear of debt. It becomes a family's insistence that children get an education so they will not be trapped by weather and land. It becomes a photograph kept in a drawer. It becomes a silence when wind rises. It becomes the reason an old man keeps jars, tools, rope and spare parts, long after anyone else thinks they are useful. It becomes the way a grandmother covers food carefully, even in a clean kitchen decades later, because some part of her still remembers dust. So tonight, when you turn off your light, or close your window, or hear weather moving outside, think for a moment of those families. Not as distant figures in black and white photographs, but as people who woke in the morning and tried again because there were children to feed, and animals to check, and debts to face, and storms to survive. Think of the mother holding a damp cloth to a child's face. Think of the father watching his soil move. Think of the children crowded into the car, looking back at a house growing smaller behind them. Think of a family arriving somewhere green and being told they did not belong. Think of all the things they carried that were not tied to the roof. Shame, hope, skill, fear, memory, stubbornness, love. The Dust Bowl took farms, crops, animals, houses and towns. Those losses were real, and many were never fully restored. But the deeper loss was the breaking of a promise people had built their lives around, that land, labour, and faith in tomorrow would be enough. For thousands of Americans, that promise failed in dust and wind. They kept moving anyway. They worked anyway. They raised children anyway. They made lives from what remained. And somewhere in that endurance is not a happy ending exactly, because history does not owe us one, but a human truth worth holding on to. People can lose the ground beneath them and still carry one another forward.